berry flavored beers, tangerine beer.
That sounds awful.
It's pretty bad. The tangerine is better of the bunch, but berry flavored beer, it's like a cough syrup from hell. It's not good.
Oh, yeah.
No. But what I'm drinking today, Dr. Farrell, is Ardbeg, and not just any Ardbeg, but the Ardbeg Corey Vrecken, named after the ship-killing giant whirlpool outside of Scotland. It's a murderous bastard, and they made a. You can see the logo is this whirlpool.
Yeah.
They made a scotch that is so immediately in your face, it's like an attack. And they needed to name it something. And so the thing they knew of that was the Leviathan of the deep
Was
was Corey Vrecken. And so they named it that the whirlpool, which devours ships. And they're like, here, taste the whirlpool.
Oh.
And it's really like that. It's an aggressive scotch. So, but sometimes you just need a slap in the face, As they say in the South, make you want to wake up and slap your mama.
Mm.
What about you? You having a beverage?
I'm having my usual raspberry tea.
Raspberry tea. I didn't mean to knock the berry beer if that's your thing, Dr.
No, I don't like berry beers. if I were still drinking, it would be half and half. Guinness and Bass Ale, half and half.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, that's good.
You mix two beers together.
You mix it. Yeah, it's an actual thing that you can get in England. You just ask for half and half. They'll give you half a Guinness, half a pint of Guinness, and then they'll put another half a pint of Bass Ale in it.
Does it good blend or does it sit in layers?
Sure. No, it blends.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
Next time I'm there, I'm going to have to try this. I've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an Irish thing, right? An Irishman wouldn't do that to Guinness.
Well, Bass, if I remember correctly, is sold in Ireland, so they might. I don't know, but they certainly do in England.
Okay. Well, Guinness is definitely one of my beers of choice, although I tend to favor some of the German black beers.
Mm-hmm.
I like a Kostriker or something, a Vorsteiner Dunkel or one of those.
Yeah, those are good beers. Mm-hmm.
But the beer that I'm getting a lot in New York City is if they don't have Bronx Ale is pretty good. But if they don't have it, I'll get Stella because you can get it anywhere. It's like Kool-Aid, and I just happen to like it. I think it's crisp, refreshing. It's the Corona of Europe.
I don't know that beer.
You never had a Stella Artois?
It's a French beer. Yeah, I may have.
Yeah, it's considered the Budweiser of Europe. It's very common. So they laugh that we charge more than like $1 for it here. But I think it's got a great aftertaste. Just a nice crisp beer. It's pretty good for yellow beer. Well, so we're here today, Dr. Farrell, and I know you're wondering about some of the stuff I sent you earlier.
Yeah, everything from pedophilia to dispensationalism to
same thing.
I was wondering, yes.
When you wake up in the morning, it's nice to get a little pedophilia in your inbox,
No, not really. People sent me, it's strange because I opened up the box this morning when I got up and I saw your links, and then somebody else sent me a link about the old Nazi Colonia Dignidad and the pedophilia charges that are being levied now in some German courts. And I thought, what is this? Is pedophilia in the ether today? But anyway.
Well, we promise, even if it's not on the ingredient label, Dr. Farrell, and even if in our shows we label it just other ingredients or natural flavors, we do put Nazis in every show.
Yes, we do.
So I just, for those of you who wondered what you're drinking, there's no MSG. It's all natural, but there are Nazis in every glass.
Yes.
Of this program. I have a dram of Nazism. It's mixed in. It's like a half and half.
It's become, fascism has become the fashionable additive ingredient in just about everything, it seems, these days.
In fact, if they were smart, they would just call it fashionableism. Or fashionism.
Fashionable fascism, yes, right.
I mean, Dr. Farrell, when the guy at the suit store is trying to sell me trousers that stop 15 inches above my ankle, and to a taper, no less. But you can not only see my sock, but the pale white glare above it. You know, and I have to buy knee socks from Scotland or something. I'm like, this is wrong. This is not what a man's suit's supposed to do. But I smell Nazism in here somewhere.
It's lederhosen.
I know, because the next thing, you start there, they bring the boots later, Dr. Farrell.
Yes, they do.
The helmets are last. Once you're in the
last.
helmet, you've been converted. You know, there's no getting out of the cult at that point. You've sold your soul.
Well, it is a cult. You know, that's the problem. It is a cult.
Well, it's an interesting topic, right?
Yes.
I mean, because you don't see a lot of European history classes that. Nice scotch. You don't see a lot of European history class. This is appropriate for the topic today. If you're going to do Nazis, you need a scotch that, like a whirlpool that slaps your mom in the face and sinks the boat she came in on. You know?
Well, actually, I didn't have the impression we were doing Nazis. I'm just wondering how we're fitting pedophilia and dispensationalism together. But...
Where the Nazi pedophilia connection, I don't know how well that's been explored, but we'll probably end with Nazis today. Nazis will be the final bouquet that we put on.
Oh yes, okay,
on the show, but a tepid aroma that you can only associate with other flavors, other natural flavors.
Oh please,
but where were we? Now I'm off track.
Yes, you're off track. Dispensationalism,
yes.
And. I forget what the other links were, but
well, I didn't send you all the links that I have. All the links that I sent Dr. Farrell will be in the show, and for those are in the show notes, as well as some others that I haven't sent, but that I will cite. And for those who don't know sort of how we do this is your first episode. Well, I send Dr. Farrell usually some preparatory materials, and I like it because he has that.
Incidentally, let the record show, are all over the board, and I have no idea what to make of it.
My goal is always to pique your curiosity.
Well, it's piqued.
Well,
it's piqued.
You know, it's the reason I don't know. I have this down to a fine-toothed process.
Yes, you do.
Because the reason I put preparatory materials in the subject line is because you have that English school kind of background, like preparatory materials for start with pedophilia and work your way up.
Daniel, come on. These are like proctological exams for you. Jeez.
Well, there are a lot of polyps in these articles that I hope our show will help to remove.
Yes, I hope so too.
Which is one of the goals. I don't go for the view from the camera. I go to get those polyps out of there. Do you want to be awake and watch? Oh yeah,
no,
but that's not why I'm here.
Don't go there.
You can do that now. They allow it. I've never been, but I got to go one of these days. I'm getting older. All right, so to kick the show off, we will eventually work our way up to Nazis. I have a few surprises up my sleeve for you, Dr. Farrell.
I'm sure you do.
The question always in my mind is who will get there first? As we begin unpacking these presents, will Dr. Farrell's mind race to the next thing before I manage to bring it up, or will I get there? We'll see. So first, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories and to kick the show off. So, and for those that don't know, Dr. Farrell gets the notes, and then he doesn't know what we're doing a show about, but he knows that these materials you probably ought to read as background material and so on. So let's talk about Nexium, not the acid reflux drug, but Nexium. It is the common name for NXIVM. Which if you Google it, you'll find is in the news, all over the news right now, and a guy named Keith Raniere. Now, Keith Raniere is the founder of this program called Nexium, or this organization that sponsors a variety of programs and sub-programs. And the most visible program that he has out there is called the Executive Success Program, or ESP. And I think it's no accident it's probably called ESP. But it sounds very inviting, Executive Success Program. I encountered it here in New York. So this is a personal story. And I debated long and hard whether to reveal this on the show, this particular story, but I thought I would, because I'm going to take one for the team so we can get into the material. So the executive success program, I encountered it here in New York, and they utilize a technique they call rational inquiry. And so far, I'm with it. You know, like executive success program sounds like something I, as a business owner, want to pursue. I want to be a better executive, a more effective business guy. I want to learn those skills. I'm open to all kinds of education, motivational, inspirational, emotional. It doesn't have to just be what year the Treaty of Westphalia took place, which is 1422. No, I'm kidding. Just to get Dr. Farrell.
1648.
But darn, I think I failed that on the test. But,
Yes.
but I thought it was 1633. Anyway, rational inquiry sounds pretty good too. It sounds like you're going to be rational and you're not going to encounter any weird things in the closet. So a colleague of mine who, shall we say, was deeply involved in this executive success program and had taken a number of the courses and was in for a round two, sort of insisted that I go. And so I went and I talked with them, and I threw kind of a fit about some of the things I thought that weren't rational and didn't make sense. And while ordinary people were kind of like, why are you making trouble? This is what we teach. The guy that sort of got me in and sold me a package basically acknowledged that I was pointing out some open areas of inquiry, and I felt like, okay, there's room here for give and take. I can come and reason with these people, and some of the things they're offering are pretty good. So I paid a fee. You got to pay up front, and you got to take these courses designed to make you a better professional and better at life. And but very quickly after I signed over my check, almost immediately after I signed over my check, because they have like an introductory 30-minute thing you can sit on, and that, but you can't sit in on anything else unless you pay. So then you pay, and then you get into the rest of the classes, and now it all starts to come out. And pretty soon I noticed they have ribbons and ranks like you do in karate. And I thought, this is a little weird. And I told them, I'm not going to wear your ribbons. But they have guys in the white ribbons and the red ribbons and the yellow ribbons. And like, what is this about? And they're like, oh, it's respect. We're paying tribute. And this is because people have earned a level of achievement. I'm like, all right, whatever, but I'm not going to wear your ribbon. And they're like, well, everybody needs to wear the ribbon. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I'm not going to wear the ribbon. So that's the first area. And then there's some point where they stood up and they kind of gave a chant or a little song or an oath sounding type of thing. It was more of a chant or a song to this guy, Keith Rainier, who they call Vanguard. And so I'm like, first off, why do people have nicknames? And so they were giving them names like Vanguard, et cetera. So this is starting to weird me out a little bit. I'm feeling the cult-like vibe, right? I'm like, all right, this doesn't look right. And of course, they got an answer for guys like me, right? I'm the smart aleck that comes in and they got an answer. And so their thing is, well, we're offering tribute and we're respecting that this person has higher rank. And I'm saying, yeah, but I don't know the guy. I've never met the guy. Why would I offer tribute to somebody I don't know? And how do I know he's achieved anything? You're just telling me to repeat this thing off a piece of paper because there's some guy somewhere that you guys respect, but I'm not going to do it. One day, if I ever meet this guy, oh, you can't meet Vanguard, not until you reach a high enough rank. And I'm like, well, since I'm not going to wear ribbons, I won't achieve the rank. And since I won't meet Vanguard, I'm not praying to the guy. And so, and then they have an oath of ethics. And so they read the oath of ethics. And this is all sort of interspersed in little workshop-y stuff where you watch videos and you do worksheets and then you discuss the videos, but the discussion is all sort of led by the teacher. I wouldn't call it a discussion. I would call it like if you told me a bunch of stuff and I could either agree or keep silent. It's kind of like that discussion. Or that kind of discussion. So they have this oath of ethics, and the oath of ethics, you agree not to do basic things that ethics are. You're not going to lie and treat people dishonorably and all that stuff. And then most of all, which I don't understand the connection to ethics, you're going to keep silent about what goes on there. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. How did that get conflated into ethics? You know,
Right.
Like I get the don't steal and don't lie and don't betray people and cheat on them, but I don't get the don't tell anybody what we're doing. And so I refused to take the oath. And I said, first, I'm against oaths. I don't take them. Secondly, I'm not agreeing to sign an NDA or keep things confidential. That's not ethical. And third, the guy with ethics doesn't need an oath to his ethics. He knows he has them. I'm not applying for my own job.
Right.
So as we go through this thing, I discover that I don't really belong in this program. And they have all these other sort of programs that are like, if you've reached this level and you want to join this program, you can. And they have spin-off sub programs and things like it's kind of cellularized, right? And so I quit. I think I go a couple of times and I'm like, look, this isn't for me. Can I get my money back? And so I got my money back and I got out. And, they did this whole thing about trying to keep me in, but I got out. And pretty soon, after about a year, they're in the news. And they're in the news and meanwhile, I know people who are going to these retreats and things like that. They're in the news for a little subgroup called DOS, which has 3 Latin letters. It's like Dominum Ordo something or the Subtitorum, but it means dominant over submissive. And it's apparently a group of women with cell leaders that circle around the leader, Keith Raniere, and they brand the women in their private parts. They use a cauterizing iron pen and they brand them. And these women are subservient and they perform sex acts and they I guess they serve, they clean your house and they make phone calls for you and they edit your articles. They do all the things that most of us would like done, except that they're held.
Don't want them done by a cult.
You don't want them done by a cult. And so they're held hostage. And the way they're held hostage is the rule of the group is apparently that they require you to do sex acts on a camera and then they store the footage away so that it can be used to prevent you from revealing what goes on in the group. So they have leverage. So this has all come out and this has swept up major stars from the TV show Hawaii Five-0, from the TV show Smallville. A whole host of celebrities in the New York and Hollywood elite have been sort of swept up in this thing. And apparently the heiress to the Seagram's fortune, like Seagram's tonic, is the major financial sponsor behind this. And then this Keith Raniere is the ringleader. So he flees to Mexico. They go down there with a search warrant. They arrest him at a $10,000 a week villa and bring him back. And so now he's on trial for sex trafficking. So needless to say, I wasn't going to bring this up on the show because it's quite embarrassing to have ever even walked in the door of a place like that. But I find this interesting for another reason. And I promise I'll tell this story shorter and then I'll stop. So not long before that, I had another friend, a completely different friend, unrelated, who likes to play basketball and hang out with guys and drink beer and all that sort of thing. He's the kind of guy you go smoke cigars with. And he said, hey, a bunch of us men get together in a park, a rather large park in New York City, let's say that way. We get together in a large park and, we meet and we discuss our issues and our troubles as men. And we work on how to become stronger and better men.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of cool. And he's like, I'd like you to come to this thing. So I'm like, all right, fine. So we get a beer, have a cigar, and go down there to the park and hang out with the men. And it doesn't take me long to figure out that this is a little bit weird because there are these sort of authoritarian captains and they're sort of telling everybody where to stand and how to stand and what to do and to be quiet. And then they're sort of speaking and there's not really any discussion. Yeah. And then there are these things where the men get in a huddle and one man sort of freaks out and the others hold him down and he pushes as hard as he can like a bull. He's sweating and he's straining and the veins are popping in his head and the other men are pushing against him. And I forget what it is, but there's some kind of name for this. And I'm looking at this and going, this is a little kooky, right? But overall, nothing too bizarre happened. And so my friend says, I want you to come back. We're having a big thing next week. This is a special night. Normally it's not like this, but we have all the other men's groups from around the state here. And so you come to a normal meeting next week. So I'm like, all right, fine, I'll come to a normal meeting. But meanwhile, I do my research. So I get online and I look it up. And it's a thing called the Sterling Institute of Relationships. And it's this guy, Sterling, that runs it. And similarly enough, there is, now again, I'm not saying that this is a cult. I'm not making any comments about the Sterling Institute or whatever, but there's a website called culteducation.com. And many of the letters pouring in and emails pouring into this website are saying, look, there's this retreat that they do in upstate New York. And incidentally, NXIVM has a retreat in upstate New York. They invite people to, and they do. It's this big thing up in the woods, right? Same thing. Sterling invites you to this retreat up there. And everybody's got to do it or you can't be a member. So you can watch, you can come a couple times, but after that, you either got to go to this retreat or you're done. And so they told me this at this second meeting. But meanwhile, I'm doing the research. I only go one more time out of courtesy to my friend. And apparently the claims are that at this meeting, they make all the men get nude, and then they have women come out in groups and shame them, slap them around, beat them around their bodies. And they film this, and then they store the footage on file to use it as leverage so that you won't reveal anything. And they're big on secrecy. So at every one of these, at both of these meetings I saw, they had these commitments to secrecy, et cetera. And which is odd, because you don't know what you're committing to be secret about. They're asking you to keep silence, but they're not telling you what they're going to do that you need to keep silent about. So it's not really a fair ethical request, right? So it's like you saying, I want you to keep silent, and then you shoot a guy in the head, and then how is that fair? I'm sorry, I don't want to honor that. So anyway, I dropped out of that. I didn't join, but I mean, I left. I didn't go back to one of their meetings in the park, and I told my colleague that this is what it's about. I don't really want to be a part of this. It sounds very cult-like. And as I've been seeing the NXIVM thing in the news, and I've been seeing the Sterling thing not going in the news and wondering about that, it got me wondering about some things I want to ask you about, Dr. Farrell. So you and I talked many years ago about a little thing called Bohemian Grove.
Yes.
And in Bohemian Grove, it is essentially a men's group. It's very Masonic in style. But importantly, it's male driven. There seems to be potentially there are stories anyway of ritual sexual debauchery, people being tied to trees nude, orgies, things like that. Some form of, in what an intelligence community you would deem sexual compromise, the ability to use leverage over it, but also tied to this sort of ritual sexuality. So you've got the same kind of elements that I'm hearing about in this Keith Raniere thing, where it's a man with a bunch of, none of the men are subservient, only the women are subservient, right? And it's, and the same thing in the Sterling group. You've got this male-driven thing with subservience, and the women are not really important. They only come out to abuse you in this sexual ritual. But as I'm thinking about these things, and I'm thinking about Bohemian Grove, and you also get this hierarchy, this powerful central figure, this person that you're supposed to give respect to. Netflix comes out with a TV series called The Ashram. And The Ashram is and it's an exposure of when Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh got kicked out of India and had to come en masse with all of his followers to Oregon. And they set up these ashrams, and there were mass orgies, and there were, you kind of know the story, right? And so here's what I want to ask you about. There seems to be embedded in our culture an underbelly of something that you don't see every day walking down the street and going to buy your donut at Dunkin' Donuts and pick up your kid from daycare. That there seems to be this underbelly of cults in the United States that operate very carefully and secretly through sexual leverage, that are around sort of male sexual power, and that are around sort of compromising, ritually compromising the adherents and sort of keeping them from everybody else. Some of these reach epic proportions, like Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's thing, and they burn out. But then there are all these smaller ones that they don't really go away until they get caught. And some of them reach sort of mythic proportions, like Bohemian Grove, where you've got skull and crossbones and whatever. My question to you is there a pattern here that people analyze cults as having an authoritarian leader, but they don't analyze cults that much from the standpoint of sexual compromise, which has been in the news a lot lately, ritual sexual debauchery, and specifically male-driven power. And I'm seeing that emerge now as I look back at the history of cults we've seen, even Jonestown.
Yes,
I'm starting to wonder if we've missed a set of earmarks that are present in the culture that typify cult activity and behavior that we're not looking at, and therefore we're not outing a lot of these cults that are.
Oh, that's a wonderful way of putting it.
Sorry to take such a long.
No, because the personal encounter with these things, I think, is valuable, because one of the things that I've noticed
firsthand, I didn't read it in a book. I was there.
I understand. And the strange behavior forces people to go out and look if they haven't switched off their critical thinking faculty or their conscience, their moral compass, which is what cults do. What I think is very interesting here with the NXIVM story, I have not followed it nearly as closely as you have, but I have followed it a little bit. And we see this, I think this, whatever this cultural phenomenon is, I just heard today about Bill Cosby's conviction. So that's another case where you have.
Yeah, that made me think of it too. I'm like, how's that related? But gut instinct, something
gut instinct is somehow that it is related because, again, you have a very prominent male figure in American culture. He was, very well known for his comedy routines, for his education philosophy, and so on. What I think we might be looking at, Daniel, particularly after I read the Sterling material, and then started thinking, just like you did, I started thinking as I was reading this, well, this sounds a lot like what we have heard in relationship to Bohemian Grove, which you've pointed out. It sounds a lot like what we've heard in relationship to fraternal secret societies like Skull and Bones, Scroll and Key, all of these Ivy League fraternal societies. It even sounds to some extent like if you have read Abbe Baruel or John Robison and their critiques of the early Bavarian Illuminati, you get a distinct, although they don't come right out and say this, but I think it's due to the modesty of the times. There's this distinct implication.
Well, with the Templars too, weren't some of the charges against the Templars involving both sexual debauchery and homosexuality?
Yes. This is something that's pervasive. And Catherine Fitz has pointed this out too a number of times that, beginning with the Franklin scandal, we began to hear of these sexual compromising situations being created where they create control files on people and thereby gain leverage over them. So what I'm sensing is a pattern, and it's a very disturbing one to me, looking at groups like NXIVM, looking at this Sterling thing, looking at some of the other things that I think probably you're going to get into, is if you look back in the last couple of years, there's been this explosion, I think, of marketing cults. In other words, what they're doing is they're dressing up cult-like behavior and activity as marketing schemes or marketing scams of professional development, personal development, what have you, things of this nature. And they're repackaging, in other words, for a modern audience, they're repackaging a lot of these old techniques that organizations like that, Templars, Illuminati, and so on, Skull and Bones, have been practicing for centuries, techniques of compromising people. And I do think absolutely that you're correct, that instead of looking at just an earmarker of an authority figure like a Jim Jones, and it's very interesting, I just finished reading a book about Jim Jones, where again, this idea of sexual compromise of individuals in the cult, of engaging in behavior that most society would view as deviant. And the other thing that's a hallmark in Jones's case was also the use of women as nothing but sex objects and how do I put it? Basically gophers, secretarial sex slaves that are also your maid and your secretary and, the person that does all the day-to-day work of administering the cult. And this was very, very prominent in Jim Jones's case. So what I think, what's disturbing to me is you're looking, I think, at a part of a pattern of packaging cult-like behavior in the guise of management theory, in the guise of One of the hallmarks, and I discussed this back when I was teaching, I think you'll remember it, of how corporations get you into these group situations where to challenge whatever little thing is the group wants you to wear. Let's wear ribbons, let's draw pictures on boxes, or some sort of absurd activity to make you subsume your individual consciousness to the group activity, which seems innocent enough when you start doing it. But when you start asking questions, as you did, they don't have answers to them. So I think you're looking at a tendency, a trend, an honest to goodness attempt to repackage the techniques of cults, of secret societies, and market them as professional or personal or spiritual or emotional development sorts of courses. I think this is a trend. Dark Journalist has been identifying some aspects of this in some of his recent broadcasts. Catherine Fitz and I have noticed this same thing, and now here you come along and say, yeah, you've noticed the same thing. It appears to be so. So leaving that aside for the moment, then you say there's some sort of deep cultural, something is deeply embedded in our culture, which I'm taking you to mean predominantly American culture or North American culture or what have you.
We do see some things happening in Japanese culture and other places in Europe that suggest a similar trajectory.
Yes, but I think the center of it's coming from here. And the reason I think that it's coming from here is it's deeply embedded in our culture, in that I think Americans are almost Freudianly sex obsessed people, because on the one hand, given our kind of the kind of Puritan background to a lot of American culture, you have a kind of what I would view as kind of an unhealthy sexual repression, and then it manifests itself. Those repressions manifest themselves, and I'm being very clumsy in this attempt to be Freudian about it, but manifest themselves in behaviors that would not be deemed deviant in Europe so much, but deviant here, and therefore they use those repressions, those cultural taboos to gain control over people. Case in point, in Europe, it's much more, they're much more open, and have been for centuries, about male-to-male affection without that having to imply anything homosexual. In this country, I think it's the Puritan influence that stamped that out, so to speak, and thus led to a lot of problems. I think there is something deeply embedded in the culture that may or may not be it. I think that's at least part of it. I think there are other factors involved, but I think genuinely what you have here is a very prurient attempt to market all of this stuff and to create a marketing template for basically a cult-like organization and behavior.
Well, it's funny that you should say that. So there's a lot of things that you said that are coming up in the show that will I think expand on that. I can't help but think back to the two books by Webb, Occult Underground and Occult Establishment, sort of as the last time that we went through this cultural trend. And of course, a lot of that centered around Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky, and was directly related to sort of, nobody calls it this, I don't know why, but I mean, you do, but we always heard about world communism in the 50s, and world Nazism or world fascism is potentially more of a concern at the time. But, and I also think of the film Eyes Wide Shut.
Bingo. Oh yes, absolutely.
The sex. I mean, I realize it's fiction, but I think it does offer sort of a template for how power and privilege, male-dominated culture, and that's like saying the same thing, and ritual sexual debauchery and leverage all tie sort of together. And also, almost inherently, when you engage in sexual debauchery, you have to subsume your sense of self. So one way to create a cult member is to just get the person to give an oath without knowing what they're giving an oath to, swear fealty to a leader they've not met, agree to keep silent about things they haven't yet seen. And then those are all subsumptions of the self, subordinations of it, or releasings of it to somebody else. Sexual debauchery achieves essentially the same thing in a very visceral and direct way.
Well, let's look at something else, another earmark of why I think you're looking at an attempt to dress up in modern marketing clothes, so to speak. This basically these templates of cult-like behavior and action, and that is this idea of secrecy. Why would you need to swear an oath for what is common morality to begin with? And then why would you need to keep any activity of whatever group you're joining secret if indeed the activity
stood up to the common morality?
Exactly. Bingo. So to me, that swearing of secrecy is a big, huge red flag right away that you're entering into kind of I wouldn't even say Gnostic. It's way beyond that. You're entering into let's be blunt, you're entering into a covenant or a contract of sorts, which is implied in the oath. But that covenant or contract, if you look at it a certain way, it's an adhesion contract. In other words, it's automatically placing you in a position of subordination to the group, to the contract itself. It's like going in to buy a car. You're handed a contract and there's no room for negotiation. So you're not being dealt with. Pardon me. You're not being dealt with as an individual person. You're being dealt with as someone subordinate already to the group. So it's very subtle the way they psychologize these techniques. And that's why I'm very worried about this trend that I see. And I'm seeing it. This is the first time I've ever heard of the Sterling Group. I'm certainly wary of this NXIVM group. I've seen and heard similar things about the Corey Goode, David Wilcock, Blue Avians alien group. There's always this marketing agenda to get you to subordinate your individual consciousness, your individual will, your individual reason to the group. And they're using all the latest marketing techniques to do this. And I find that very, very disturbing.
Well, I certainly will agree that when I go to a car dealership, or for that matter, talk to a realtor, and the first thing out of their mouth is, how much do you want to spend? They hate it, by the way, when I say as little as possible, but because what they're already asking me to sort of subordinate my own control over the evaluation of value.
Right.
So I don't know, if I think it's valuable enough that it adds up to a certain amount of money that I got, maybe I'll buy it. But I'm not coming to you, not sight unseen, just going, right, I want to spend $1 million. What do you got? Right. I want to see what you got, and I want to decide what's valuable enough that I want to spend. And so the thing is in reverse. I will never answer that question. Walk into a car dealership, how much you want to spend? Because they're asking me to subordinate my sense of value to an existing system of value. So an example, I'm going to tell 2 more stories. These are going to be a lot shorter, but the reason I brought personal stories is what the cults say, especially if you just take Scientology as an example, which I'm not saying is a cult, but they get really bent out of shape when you call them a cult, and when you make claims that aren't based on that are based on some book or some article. Now, even so, if the representatives of any group I were mentioning here tonight said, well, that's just your experience you had there, and you had a bad experience, and that's based on your warped mind or who you had as a group leader or whatever. I mean, they can say that, but you get enough testimonials that, hey, they make us take our clothes off, and then they have women come out dressed as nuns and beat us. Then it gets, it's eventually you start to wonder is, wow, that's a lot of different people writing in from different parts of the country saying that happened on a different one of your special weekend retreats.
Exactly.
So all I can do is say, people can take what pot shots they want. All I got is what I got. So a couple of other really quick stories. um, because I don't feel ashamed for asking questions and going out and sampling what's out there. I would feel ashamed if I got myself branded and became somebody's sex toy slave. But which I don't mean to pick on the women who did that. I mean, they were brainwashed, but at the same time, I mean, man, not for me. As you know, Dr. Farrell, I do not go with groupthink very well. You've seen me in those environments. Well, I was at Northeastern State University, NSU, in Tahlequah, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And this was before I met you, Dr. Farrell. This is when I was actually going directly to the campus and not in Tulsa, where I met you.
Mm-hmm.
But when I went up there, you know, being on campus is a little bit different than being in sort of a community urban center where you just kind of check into college and then go back to your job.
Right.
So when you're on campus, there are these campus only activities. There's not much else to do in town. And so one of the things you always consider is whether to join a fraternity. And I'd always kind of rolled my eyes at it, but again, not much to do. And everybody seems to be joining a fraternity. So I pledged a fraternity, partly because they didn't care about age. They had a lot of older guys in it. And so I was like, all right, this is curious. They have parties. I can go tonight, hang out, drink beer, learn more about it. Always wanted to learn the Greek alphabet. So I went, and once again, I seemed to quit really quickly. I never made it past the first class. So I went to a party, then they have class number one. I go to class number one, and class number one is Introduction to the Greek Alphabet. I'm like, okay. But before they introduce the Greek alphabet, they bring in the alumni of the fraternity, and they're going to have them talk about the old days of what it was really like in the good old glory days of the fraternity when men really bonded. And the first thing they do is describe their hazings and a ritual that is too vulgar for me to describe. But let's just say that it involves a favorite form of American fast food sold at baseball stands and insertion into the male body. And and I'm out at that point.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
So I literally stand up in Greek letter class, and I'm got my hand up and everything, like, yeah. And I said, you know, pledges aren't supposed to speak. And I said, I got a problem. I don't want this. I'm never going to do anything like that. I don't want to be a part of it. And it disturbs me deeply that you do. And they said, well, you know, everybody's got their problem. And if you don't feel comfortable, you know, you can leave. And I'm like, it's not my problem. I'm seeing a problem with you guys, you know, but
yeah, no kidding.
I'm what I was when I walked in, which is fine with my life and not needing to join a hot dog penetration party. But their argument was, well, we don't do that anymore. That was the old days. That was an early stage. And I'm like, the fact that you ever did, the fact that that was even ever a point of discussion considered and was done, let alone tried, and the fact that you have emissaries from that time coming in to tell us about those good old days, that's really all I need to know. I'm not down with this, even if it's like saying, sure, we tortured and burned people alive in the old days in our religion, but we don't do it anymore. I'm like, I'm out. I'm done. I'm sorry. I'm not bowing. So they were, needless to say, mad and tried to persuade me that I had some kind of secrecy agreement and couldn't tell anybody about it. But I didn't sign anything, and I certainly wouldn't have. And if I sign something not knowing what I'm signing away secrecy to, I don't think it'll stand up in a court of law. It wasn't specified in the document. Sorry. My signature's there, but it doesn't say I will keep the hot dog secret. So that's the first thing. Again, male bonding at a college level, modern era, sexual depravity, and in essence, a kind of leverage, because do you really want your friend standing up in a new corporate job that you have and saying, well, I know Billy, he once took a hot dog, you know, and it wasn't an Oscar Mayer. It was a Nathan's footlong.
Oh, please.
There's a level of leverage and embarrassment, as you say, kind of a control file built in, as well as kind of the implied thing. I mean, they almost suggested we're going to beat you up if you throw a fit about this, because I'm like, hey, I think I'll tell the school newspaper. All right, second point, second story. So there in New York, we have more of everything. So a lot of people like to give a hard time. Well, people out in New York and California, what you got to realize is there's 10,000 more of everything in New York and California. We just have a lot more options. So of course, you might have 3 cults in Greensboro, South Carolina. In that same geographic area, we're going to have 300 because we're just big and we're dense. So there's a lot in New York, and a lot of these, as you say, they're using modern marketing and polish, and they're putting the ads on the subway. It'll say, "Come for an introspective inquiry into personal development." The School of Philosophical Inquiry. It'd be something like that. And I know right away from, frankly, studying history with you that, Gnosticism, I recognize it right immediately, right? But there was one I fought for the longest time. So my girlfriend, when I met her, she had some really powerful tools for dealing with anger, some other things. And I asked her where she got them, and she told me it was Landmark Education. And as you know, I've told you before, I became a student of Landmark Education, and I went through the program. And to this day, I love it. And what's different about it that makes it not a cult is, first, they don't get very much money. They're barely scraping by. So there's none of this, give me $3,000 and we'll tell you what's going on later. Secondly, I stood up and fought them harder than I fought any of these groups, even the hot dog people. And they rolled with it. They're like, okay, and you don't have to leave. And you're right, I can't answer your question. Stick around. We'll see if we can figure this out together. Let's talk after. And some of them are like, hey, he's got a point. Give him the microphone. I'm like, okay, this is different. And so there was actually openness for rational inquiry. That prohibition on questions that I learned from you as a hallmark of Gnosticism, that typified the men's group, the Sterling thing, the NXIVM thing, and the fraternity. That prohibition on questions wasn't in play. So what I took away from that is there are people, there are legitimate forms of, you might call it emotional education or personal development stuff.
Sure.
That whether it's NLP or it's Landmark, that are out there, but they don't adhere to the earmarks of a cult. There's no leader. In fact, they tell you that. They're like, we invented all of this stuff and we just mishmashed it from things we found it useful and constructed a tool set. You don't have to use them all, take it or leave it. Anything you don't want, leave behind. We don't need your money. By the way, we're giving you more free classes. Here, have 10 more free classes to go with the one you paid for. We just do that with everybody. And then it's just not a cult, right? And what I'm reminded of is a very obscure reference that I don't even, I hesitate to bring it up in the show because it's so obscure, but it's the only one I have for this. There is an archbishop that was considered the first Orthodox archbishop of North America, Efthymios. And Efthymios actually was a legitimate Orthodox archbishop in a fully recognized jurisdiction of Holy Orthodoxy. But as it so happens, fast forward to now, and there's a million splinter groups and break-off groups that claim that their sort of succession comes out of Archbishop Efthymios, because things were kind of obscure and not as well, records weren't kept as well, and there's a certain amount of antagonism toward Archbishop Efthymios. And so when you see an Orthodox church that says we're an independent Orthodox Church of Chicago or whatever, and they say, but we have our succession through Efthymios, there's a good bet that it's just a bunch of made up stuff and somebody that doesn't want to play along. But that doesn't mean the real thing isn't there. It just means that we need some kind of tool set to distinguish between the real thing. So Efthymios is the best example that I have. So here's the point. So it seems to me that in order that you can't just cut off your life and say, I don't want to participate in any religion. I don't want to participate in any education that isn't textbook. And I don't want to listen to anybody that can, I don't want to listen to Tony Robbins because it sounds like this cult leader, right? Who stole his idea, in fact, and is just riffing on Tony Robbins and then collecting a paycheck. But we need some kind of tool set of discernment, tools of discernment. And the problem is the only time I've ever heard that phrase used is in fundamentalist evangelicalism. And it's very much tied to its own form of sort of cultism at times, where that becomes a catchphrase for deciding everybody but us is wrong. It literally reinforces the cult. Tools of discernment are how the cult defends itself. And so I've never actually seen anybody say, here is a toolkit of discernment to be able to engage in exploratory philosophy, psychology, motivational thought, inspiration, becoming a better leader. That's not a hard skill. That's not in a textbook. That's something you have to go have talks and workshops to do. But that helps you recognize and separate out cult-like behavior. I have that gut response of I'm not going to bow to anybody. It's not just the no hot dogs rule.
Yeah,
It's
same here.
it's that I recognize when somebody asks me to sign a privacy agreement and it doesn't specify what I'm being private about. I mean, in a contract between you and I, where we sue each other and we have a settlement and we agree what the settlement is, and then we agree to privacy, we know what we're being private about. But when I sign a privacy agreement that just says anything we tell you is kept in secret from now on, that's a little iffy. So where does one get that tool set? How do we develop that? Or do you not concur that that's something we need to be figuring out?
No, I think we do need to be figuring it out because, like I said, I think there's too much. Again, I'm going back to what I said before. I think that we're watching an explosion of the application of marketing techniques to disguise what is essentially not only cult-like behavior but actual cults. I think the two biggest tools. I put a webinar up in the members area about Gnosticism some time ago, where I talk about the two things that Gnosticism always does. Is number one, as you said, it prohibits questions, and number two, the other part of the agenda that I don't think people are really on board, they haven't really figured this out yet, is that it always demands that you use its own buzzwords and use those buzzwords in the way that it approves. That's how you signal your assent to whatever agenda it is that you've subscribed to. If you've become a member of one of these cults, is you have to start signaling your assent by the use of a particular phraseology and use of particular words and using them in the way that they prescribe. So those two things for me are hallmarks. The other thing that is always a big hallmark for me is precisely this element of secrecy. Why would you need to be secret about common morality? Well, answer, you wouldn't need to be. So in other words, if they're coming to you with a blanket secrecy agreement, sign this, and you're not being told what it is that you have to keep secret, I'd walk out the door just like you did. Bye, that's it for me. I'm not signing over a blank check for my individual reason, my individual sovereignty, or anything like that. And I'm worse than you in that I have been to some of these professional development type of things where group activities were prescribed, and I simply didn't participate because what I thought was really going on was the group was being asked to do something nonsensical and childish precisely in order to subsume an adult responsibility for action. And the leader of the group came to me and said, "Why aren't you with your group? Why aren't you participating?" And I said, "I am participating in my own way. I thought you said that was okay." And she took great offense, great umbrage, and just kind of avoided me through the rest of the whole program. But I think you have to look at those three things for starters as tools of discernment: the demand for unquestioned secrecy, which ultimately translates, I think, into a demand for absolute obedience. This is really what they're after. Prohibition of certain kinds of questions, and then the linguistic agenda. In other words, signal your assent to the agenda by the use of language in the prescribed fashion that we dictate. That's a biggie for me. We see that all over the culture right now, and there's few people standing up to challenge it. And even the people that are trying to challenge it really don't know where this impetus is really coming from. And again, it's coming out of this disguised marketing of essentially cult-like behavior.
Well, when I bring up these discernment tools, one of the people I'm thinking of is, I forget her last name, but her first name's India. And in the article I sent you, it talks about her, that she's still in this cult. She's still defending it, and is her parents are saying she's brainwashed and nobody can reach
Mhm.
her. And so, they always have a different explanation. Oh, those people that accuse him of branding people's private parts, they're just lying. The press is out to get us. And of course, he's a great leader, so he takes flack from the spiritual underworld. I mean, there's a million things you can say to defend your guru. And once the person is caught, I remember when Jim and Tammy Faye Baker were exposed, and
Yes.
all the people that kind of came out and said it's conspiracy of the devil to
Yes.
tarnish their reputation. And I'm like, well, the devil wasn't needed in this case. They did a good enough job themselves, But
Yep.
as I bring this up, I know there are people thinking, and by the way, there's a couple of bombshells I plan to drop in this show. So if you're kind of going, wait, we're going there slowly, people, just wait. It's coming, because it's like the beginning of a good novel. You gotta have a few sips before you can really get to the hard stuff. So, but we might be thinking, I would never do that. I would never get involved in any of those groups. I'm not interested in psychology or self-help, and I know what my religion is, so therefore I'm totally safe.
Mm-hmm.
But to that, I would say, Dr. Farrell, there are 3 great changes I made in my life. Really 4, but 3 great changes that I'm really proud of, and they all have to do with breaking away from a kind of cult, in quote marks. One of those was breaking away from a particular religion, and I left because it really was a cult, and it was trying to punish me for thinking and asking questions and doing my own research, etc. And I've done that a couple of times and just been like, nope. Another, though, is academia. To me, academia was a cult. I don't mean that all academia is, or all professors
No,
are
I
in cults.
understand very good what you mean.
But
I agree.
The invitation I had to academia, when a graduate university said to me, look, your goal is not, if you want to survive, if you don't want to be kicked out of our group, your goal is not to stick your head up and say anything that would be off track of what any of our existing professors are thinking about, or that would embarrass them because they didn't think of it, or that would conflict with any opinions they've expressed. But instead, what you want to do is figure out a way to help them publish or perish, complete their research, ingratiate yourselves with them. And then if you really succeed, not only will you not get kicked out, but you might be able to be an adjunct professor at a rural college somewhere, if you're lucky. And after serving months as a TA, a teaching assistant, grading papers for some professor that needs to publish. And I said, actually, that's what you're hoping for? I mean, that's the outcome, that you can scrape by on a rural professorship at some college, someplace you don't want to live, teaching somebody else's stuff so that you can pad their reputation.
Well, as you know, I have the very same experience back when I was teaching. So
I absolutely
you're preaching to the choir here.
So we're fellow travelers on this perception that in some ways modern academia is just as cult-like as something like NXIVM or any or the ashram. Another one, though, was corporate life. I found that the absolute fealty one had to essentially swear to middle managers, that they're right even when they're wrong, that you can't question authority even when what they're doing is questionable, that you have to fit, which means you have to use the right language, say the right things, dress the same way, and act almost robotically. That was cult-like. So I pride myself on having left a religion, left academia, left corporate life, and started my own business. And even I think certain cultures can be that way. I left a particular cultural environment that I didn't like. But I think all of us are susceptible to at least one of those. Raise your hand if you've never touched religion, academia, corporate life, or a local culture. Even a small town can be a cult.
Look at the modern American, or even more broadly, Western corporate culture, because I have a friend that I talk with about this quite a lot. He wrote a book called The Toxic Stakes of America, and his name is Matt Sosha, and it's a good book because he points out that the modern corporate culture is basically psychopathic, and in some cases sociopathic. It's narcissistic. In other words, yeah, you're dealing with a lot of middle managers. You never question authority, even if you see that what they're doing is leading to the demise of the corporation.
Right.
And
Control is more important.
yeah, the control is more important. And, be a team player. I taught many courses back when I was teaching about management ethics and so on and so forth. And again, I was noticing in these textbooks this emphasis on team player. Well, again, you are being asked to switch off your mind, your will, your perception of things to go along. And, I ran into this at the casino that I was a manager at. There were some things that I noticed that were simply not compliant with the National Indian Gaming Commission. And I paid the price for, bringing this to people's attention. This mentality is everywhere. I suspect in a large part that within the corporate world, it's due again to that idea of the persona ficta, the idea that a corporation is its own person. And what that means is you basically create a collectivist group culture that's grounded in a metaphysical principle. It's grounded in a principle of jurisprudence that locks you in, that you cannot break out of that without disputing the whole foundation of the corporation itself. So yeah, I think this what we're dealing with, I think culturally, is it's not just religious people. I think that it's equally easy for agnostics or atheists to get caught up in this type of culture of a cult. And I'm trying to find words. I'm not saying all corporations are cults or things like this, but we do have a culture that is cult-like in the way it's manifesting itself, because the old checks and balances, which are reliant upon a common morality and individuals exercising responsibility for themselves, for their conscience, for their perceptions, is being gutted almost everywhere we turn, and we're seeing the social result. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I do view academics today in large part. I suspect that it's particularly true in the so-called soft disciplines, history, sociology, anthropology, and so on. But even to a certain extent now in the hard sciences, more and more this cult-like groupthink activity has taken over the academy, and the academy is suffering as a result. That of all these trends bothers me the most, because what we're really saying as a result of that is that the leadership class, be it political, financial, corporate, whatever, even religious, that the leadership class is no longer capable of thinking outside of its own box, because they've come out of this culture of groupthink, team players, and all of this happy claptrap. So they're no longer able to come up with any genuine solutions or innovative solutions, and that bothers me. We're finding this across the board, and I don't know any other. I don't know of any correction to it other than just people standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to do that, and fully realize that if they do, and they do that, they may lose their scholarship or their job or what have you. But until people start doing that, it's going to get worse.
Well, I think one of the challenges is that even if we handed people tools of discernment, we're mired in it. It's hard to know you're in a cult when you're in a cult. Yes. And so we have the cult of the pious expressed in a lot of religious groups. We have the cult of the academic. We have the cult of the corporate person. We have the cult of the town or region. People saying, I'm a Southerner. And so you have the cult of the South. I'm a Yank. You have the cult of that. I'm from this part of South Carolina. When my mom died, they were scared to death because I was Orthodox and I was going to do some wiki-do ritual around the coffin. So they pulled me aside and made an extensive, emphatic point of saying, I mean, it's my mom, but they said, I'm the closest relative on the ground. But they said, round here. And in the South, that's a big thing. Round here. Round here is a preface for you don't do anything that doesn't match around here, or you liable something's going to happen to you. But around here, we do funerals a certain way, and we're going to do this. We're going to have a group around it. We're going to lower the thing in the body, etc. And I basically just said, look, I don't care what wiki-do rituals you do around here, but I said, when you're done, I'm going to go up to the coffin and I'm going to say my own prayers when the group moves away, and then I'm going to leave. So if that's a problem, tell me now, because I'm still going to do it around here. So, but I was getting the cult of the town or region, that there is something here that under which your personal needs or personal wishes are subsumed, even as something as so delicate as that. We're in a culture
where, whether we like it or not, we're part of some cult.
That's what I'm saying. You get the cult of the state. We have people that are saying, I'm an American nationalist. And I'm like, what you just did is outed yourself as a cult member. At some point, you can't call yourself a sovereign individual and then call yourself an American nationalist too. And even if you're a sovereign individual, apparently we have the cult of sovereign individuals that have accounted for some of the recent shooters that are attacking the White House and breaching stuff. One of the recent shooters uses that magic language of I'm a sovereign citizen. You've got the cult of race or subculture, and of every color, whether you're white or black or what. So R. Kelly is a rapper, and I'll include in the show notes an article from Vox. But a quote is, last summer, he was accused of creating an abusive, quote, sex cult, unquote, of very young women whom he allegedly isolates, brainwashes, and abuses physically and emotionally. Since the story broke, multiple women have added their own testimonies of abuse at R. Kelly's hands. And through a lawyer, Kelly denied all accusations, saying he would work diligently and forcibly, et cetera, to clear his name. And so you have many of us who have the cult of fame. The moment you sort of rise to a Bill Cosby sort of stature or whatever, almost the first go-to place is becoming, well, now that I've reached this stature, I can now abuse people as slaves or brainwash them or whatever. And it's almost like you're already in a cult. It's not that the cult, you had to join it or start it. You're in it. You just need to achieve the rank, as they said at NXIVM. You need to get the right color of belt. And then when you do, the people below you have to start taking crap, and the people above can still tell you what to do. So, Dr. Farrell, I notice a hallmark of two hallmarks of cults that I don't think are widely called out. One is that cults seem to follow a multi-level marketing pyramid scheme format, where if you, in a minute, we'll do the review of the earmarks of a cult before we get on to the bombshells. But one of the earmarks of the cult, if you study some of these lists that either they put out in Psychology Today, or you can go to the Anti-Defamation League, is an incredible emphasis on membership drives. The moment you convert, you got to go out and get new members, right? Well, that's what you get in multi-level marketing. You get people that, now that I sell this brand of green herbal tea, shake mixture, smoothie stuff, I have to go out and get other people, because otherwise it doesn't keep working. And once I achieve a certain rank, I can now exploit the workers under me, and they'll go out and get the other people, but I can just sort of rest on the residual profits.
Yeah, it's Amway, it's the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's communism, it's Nazism. Once you join the cult, go out and recruit everybody. Yeah,
so you got the one hallmark is that multi-level marketing aspect of it, and the other hallmark, which isn't required. It is required in multi-level marketing, but it's not the only place you see it. Is sort of the franchise approach. So at the same time, you have NXIVM doing these franchises, basically founding other groups and types of organizations that are all under the NXIVM umbrella. One thing that I encountered, as you know, is, and I'm not saying everybody that comes out of this is in a cult, but my early brushes with Dallas Theological Seminary and the Bible churches that came out of it, it always disturbed me, Bible church, because it sort of meant I'm under an umbrella of other things, but I ultimately decide what truth is. And everywhere I went, when I ran into these, this was my first encounter really with Christianity as a 17-year-old. And I everywhere I went, they were very different, but they were led by these charismatic leaders who were trained in Dallas Theological Seminary. Is a hyper dispensationalist, hyper sort of Bob theme like environment, and but there were serious problems with don't question the leader; he's appointed by God. People used to come up to me just randomly who'd never met me and say, "You have a problem with authority. I can sense it." And I'm like, "I really do. I don't believe it exists. I don't wake up in the morning going, who's in authority over me? That's not how I was born free." And then I see problems with it that are similar to cults. I had a friend that was in one of these Bible churches, and she was being pressured by the pastor to date him and being told that she would keep his advances secret if she was a true woman of God, because women of God are women of discretion and therefore they keep secrets. And so she was nearly killing herself with stress, hair falling out, finally coming to me in tears saying, "Look, this guy's being a sexual predator toward me, and I'm trying to be a woman of God, and he tells me I'm going to go to hell if I reveal his secrets, because I won't be a woman of God, but I've got to tell somebody that I don't know how to get out of this." And I'm like, "You're in a cult, sweetheart." And I can't help but seeing those two earmarks, the multi-level marketing thing and the franchise mechanism, because those Bible churches are a franchise, for instance. I'm not knocking them all, but I'm saying that it's certainly one of the places I encountered cultism.
Right.
Those are hallmarks.
To me, as you know, the problem here with this, since we're concentrating on cult-like manifestations within evangelical religion, which always disturbed me too. I came very early on to the conclusion, given where I went to college, I was surrounded by people of that belief system.
And why they called it BJU, right, Dr. Farrell?
Well, it was John Brown, yeah.
Oh, it's JBU. Okay,
yeah, JBU,
it's not Jones University.
No, heavens, no, I wasn't that bad.
Okay.
But I came very quickly and early to the conclusion that this is a side effect of the papacy on Western history, because again, what you have is an unquestioned personal authority that, if you really examine the structure of it, if you examine its claims, is very, very cult-like in nature, even to the point of having used that authority, or I would say abused that authority, to go out and literally wage warfare against anybody that disagreed with it internally in Western Europe. You know, think of the Albigensian Crusade, where, again, to me, this is the manifestation of a cult that is very large and very powerful, and which essentially has not backed off of any of its claims. And now, you know, they're suffering because they've got a pope who's looking increasingly like he's not really Roman Catholic at all, but, you know, he's got the authority of it. So to me, it's a deeply embedded phenomenon within Western culture. And again, I want to stress that you don't simply have to look at religion to find these figures, because you can find these figures in their secular Gnostic, if you will, manifestation. You know, people like Robespierre or Danton or Weishaupt or Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, you know, the list goes on, where you've got a leader of an ideology, of a set of principles that they think they've unlocked the key to history, and everybody else has to, you know, go along and signal their assent by the proper use of language, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think it's deeply, deeply embedded within Western culture. It's not accidental, in my opinion, that you see the rise of not atheism, but organized philosophical militant atheism, which is a very different thing, in the West, because again, it's coming out of the same cultural conceptual matrix where you have the idea of the all-important leader figure. And you mentioned Dallas. The thing that I find very interesting about Dallas is that they would be, I think, shocked and appalled to find out.
You're right. Sorry, you Dallas guys.
but they would be shocked and appalled to find out that, the basic tenets of their dispensational theology is coming out of the 13th century Roman Catholic Church from a Franciscan monk who, Joachim of Fiore, I'm thinking about, who goes to the extent of not only proposing an essentially dialectical quasi-Hegelian view of history, but he's also going to the extent of proposing a kind of future communistic state in which all distinctions and classes are eradicated. And of course, he follows this up with the idea that the person that's going to do all of this is the Dux et Babylon, the Duke of Babylon, who's some sort of super leader figure that is, going to Messiah-like lead the world into a better place. So again, it's deeply embedded in our culture for whatever reason. And I want to stress that it has both a religious manifestation and it has a non-religious, atheistic manifestation. And it's very difficult at times, even in Joachim, to try and sort out the two.
Well, I think Dallas would also be upset, the notion that anybody's calling them a cult, because they're big on that, exposing cults. But what they mean is basically exposing anyone that doesn't agree with them, which is not hard. Just everybody else. That's all you got to say.
Right.
Everybody else is a cult, but instead by creating a taxonomy of this is this kind of not us and this is this kind of not us, it looks like you're not actually saying that everybody but us is a cult, but it clearly you do that. That's the problem with a lot of these cult study centers. Well, I want to do, before we get to the bombshell section, because I got a couple of big ones I want to drop and try on you. I want to return just to this notion of gnosis. So you wrote what I still consider to be a seminal paper about Gnosticism at one point, and I believe it may be available. It may be extant for sale. I can't remember if it's one of the ebooks that we put out. But in this paper, you claim that Gnosticism, that the early Christian fathers had, even by the time of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, are using a strategy in the 3rd century to combat Gnosticism that's ineffective, and that it's effective for a short time, but it never lasts. So what their strategy is expose the name of the cult, who the leader is, their claims, and then to refute those claims. And the problem is very often that would shame these groups out of existence, which back then there was still shame, would shame them out of existence, but then they would pop up, it would just morph and become something else and pop up in a different way. One of the followers would create another spin-off group. And your argument was that Gnosticism is not a particular set of beliefs, that, say, Dallas Theological Seminary would be mistaken to say, here's the definition of a cult in the form of they believe X, Y, and Z. Because you hear that a lot. You hear Mormons are cult members because they don't believe in the deity of Christ. Jehovah's Witnesses are cult members, X, Y, Z. The problem is a more authentic definition of a cult, or a form of Gnosticism might be another way of putting it, is you argue that Gnosticism is a process. It is a particular process for denying questions, for elevating authority, and for claiming superior wisdom to all other people, and thereby insulating yourself from rational inquiry.
And linguistic agendas.
And you did sort of a whole process analysis or process taxonomy of it. So what we do find is that most of the, whether it's the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Anti-Defamation League or the FBI or just Psychology Today, most of the modern analysis of a cult follows your line of thinking. So it does not identify particular belief content. It doesn't matter if you're a UFO cult or the cult of Elvis. It lays out earmarks like the following. Number one, one-way confidentiality. So they trust, they don't, they want you to trust us, but we don't trust you.
Right.
So we will keep videos on you in our files, but you have to swear to our privacy.
Right.
Believe first, understand later, or believe first and swear loyalty first and then understand later.
Right.
Authority by assumption or by fiat. These people are an authority because we say they are, accept it. Kind of a cell-like cover or blinds, which you've talked about before as a Masonic technique. We're going to tell you this, but then we're going to tell you it means it's actually something different later when you achieve a certain rank. So part of the reason to have ranks in a cult is to reveal what we're actually doing. Well, actually, we have a spin-off group with sexual slavery, but we didn't tell you that in the early days because you wouldn't have stuck around, and by now you're sort of in it. There's obviously the authoritarian leadership. So this emphasis on submission and control, it really is a sub-dom kind of environment. So that DOS name is probably the perfect name for any cult ever, dominance over submission. You get an enlightened leader who has his own ethics. So the moment you have a central party, we start saying because that leader is more enlightened, we allow special behavior, make allowances for them. So if he has sex with children, or if it's Jeff Jeffries and he marries 23 little girls or whatever, then that's okay because look at his great contributions.
Yeah, think of David Koresh or Jim Jones, as examples of that. Absolutely.
Yeah. So a certain set of behaviors are acceptable for me, but not for you. And again, that overlaps really neatly with the culture of academic administrators and middle managers in corporate life. There's a certain set. Insubordination was always my favorite word because it just meant I disagreed with the manager, or I didn't think his behavior was right. There's exclusivism. So you have kind of inside truth that nobody else has. That's that thing that the apostles always said. That they said the chief sign of a Gnostic is he thinks he's wiser than the apostles. He has inside truth that even Christ didn't have. He's enlightened. There's isolationism, which is all about boundaries, and they can be emotional isolationism, like, hey, stick with us. And that drives this thing where you get this social insulation where these people become your new friends. And so you're encouraged to socialize with other members. They have all kinds of parties, groups, and outings that you're encouraged to spend time with your new friends. And one way you do that is not say we should be your only friends, but instead you say every encounter should be a learning encounter. And you don't get that with your friends. You don't get this enlightened conversation with your friends. So stick with us where we have the enlightened conversation. And it's easier than saying we should be your new friends. And you get the group think, which is always opposed to independent thinking. We've talked about that a little bit. We get the fear of ostracization. That's what that young lady that was being abused by her pastor is doing. She was afraid of some kind of spiritual disbarment. But it's been analyzed that what cults do is they get very sophisticated. They leverage a belief that there's no real life outside the cult. If you go out there, you're just back to ordinary drone-like life. And so there's really no other way to be. You can have this enlightened thing. You don't want to lose at any cost. Or you can go back to your life before us. And in some ways, cults do improve your life. If they didn't, they wouldn't be able to hold you and tell you, hey, we're the ones that improved your life. Remember your life before. So they can help you get off drugs and they can help you fix relationships and things like that. But unfortunately, with that, you're taking a little bit of rat poison in your Kool-Aid. And then they have those pyramid-like membership drives that are really about money, about work for free for a certain number of hours, bring in a certain number of members, and then we'll promote you to spiritual captain, and then you can start getting your own members, and we'll give you a cut. And so you get the multi-level marketing stuff. Those are all earmarks of cults that are called out by all the sources I just mentioned. My question to you is twofold. A, does that dovetail fairly well with your analysis that you did early on about Gnosticism? B, actually it's threefold. B, if so, why do we not, other than the guy that wrote about political Gnosticism I asked you about recently, why do we not treat this as a form of Gnosticism and we just use the word cult like it's some generic thing and it's whatever we think it is? It seems like that word is not helpful. It's self-defeating because we don't analyze it as a process. And C, what have we left out?
Well, I do think that, we are in danger of misidentifying what's really going on in the broad culture when we concentrate solely on the idea of a cult rather than the idea of the processes that are used to inculcate and to promote the cult and to recruit new members into the cult. I would prefer that we view this exactly as Eric Voegelin, who was the fellow that I mentioned to you. That Voegelin, I think, really pinned it very, very well. And of course, he's hated to this day by a lot of analysts that are, professional academics in political science or what have you. Voegelin, I think, was astute enough in his studies of ancient religion and astute enough in his political analysis to be able to see what was going on, which is why he labeled it Gnosticism. I do think
book, by the way, the New Science of Politics.
Yeah,
Eric Voegelin.
Very, very good book. The one missing component here that I think is missing is the idea of Gnostic systems, be they religious or atheistic or secular, whatever you wish, wherever they fall on the spectrum, is that they do have one very common overarching conceptual and process structure in common. And that is, number one, and this is particularly true of ancient Gnostic systems, they all have in common some sort of implicit dialectic of oppositions or implicit dualistic structure. But in more modern systems, I'm thinking like, for example, of the system of Adam Weishaupt with the Bavarian Illuminati. I'm thinking of Marxism and its dialectic and so on and so forth. I think we have to look at that as being one of the defining factors, because if you look at its evolution throughout Western history, it begins, as you know, as an importation into the Western formulations of doctrine, particularly the doctrine of the Trinity. Then, in the hands of Joachim of Fiore, it's turned into a dialectical process within history itself. And the reasoning here is rather simple. If God is the Lord of history and dialectical processes of opposition can describe God, well, then it must be the case that those same processes are capable of describing the historical evolution. In other words, dialectic becomes the key to history, and it becomes the key, therefore, to figuring out where we're going. And finally, by the time that you get from Joachim to Hegel and Marx, that dialectic not only is transformed from the key to history, it now becomes the key to social and political process. So it starts off as a metaphysic, it becomes a historical principle, and finally it ends up, as an organizing principle for politics. So again, this idea of groups, putting people in groups in this big dialectical struggle, is part of the governing technique. And, the bottom line for us Americans is that structure is enshrined in the Constitution, which is very problematic, in my opinion, because you have a structure that is designed for perpetual conflict. In the hands of the Marxists, if it, of course, becomes a dialectic that's supposed to lead you to the perfect state of a classless society and so on and so forth. And in every case, from the ancient Gnostics to Joachim and his system, you see the Franciscans so adopting his program that it does become, to a certain extent, in the High Middle Ages, a program of ostracism. So in other words, if you're not on board with Joachim's plan, then you're not part of the spiritual coming elite. That manifests itself in the Soviet Union. If you're not a party member, then you are, to a certain extent, a fundamental outcast in society. So again, church, party, cult, all of these things can be transformed by means of these techniques into basically groups that have cult-like or Gnostic-like tendencies, where to challenge the whole structure is to ostracize you, to alienate yourself from society.
Well, one could thereby argue that we are all in a cult to a certain degree because if you think of the opposite of a cult, and the opposite would be a form of the same thing. If you think of the opposite of a cult, you say the cult of so-and-so, the cult of Jim Jones, the cult of David Koresh. Then the opposite would be to sort of be the people who are not Jim Jones or not David Koresh. And so you once basically said that the problem with dialectic is when you define yourself by your opposite, you have to carry around your opposite forever in your definition of yourself.
Yes, exactly.
You are essentially a form of yourself. To be Protestant is essentially to be Roman Catholic, because you're defining yourself as
an opposition to something,
right? Which is the whole problem with the theological structure coming out of St. Augustine, or at least Augustinism, which is, what is the definition of the Father? Well, he is not the Son. And what is the Son? Well, he is not the Holy Spirit.
Right. You end up defining personhood itself, as a dialectic where you are constantly in opposition to other people.
And so if you could imagine America, I mean, it'd be a vastly different place. If you took America and you stopped all conversation about, look at those people, what they're doing is wrong. Look at these people, should we bomb them? Should we invade? Look at these people, they voted against me. Look at these people, they're in control of government and they're doing it wrong. If you took all that away, we'd be silent as a culture. There's nothing to talk about anymore.
Right.
Because I would say that's 90% of the media going over the airwaves every day. Yeah. And 90% of the conversation I have at cigar bars. I'm getting tired of cigar bars, by the way. I've been smoking my cigars off my balcony. And because it's either that or with a friend off the balcony, or with a friend on the phone. Because when I go to cigar bars, all I meet is other men who want to blow hard and grandstand about, either A, some theory about government, or B, how much money they're spending. And they want to show off, and there's this bid for dominance and control and cult-like behavior even there. Seems to be built into the ape, the primate, that we want to establish dominance and control and ranks. But that cult-like behavior of this group of people are what's wrong with our society. This group of people are responsible for taking us out of a golden age. All of that is cultism. And it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a libertarian or a fraternity member. It's all essentially a form of cultism, because you're essentially defining yourself over against
something else,
which is de facto cultism.
Well, remember that Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles, I think it's part one or part 4, questions 72 and 73. I'm pretty certain about the question number. I'm a little fuzzy on which part it's from. I think it's actually part 4. But in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Thomas Aquinas says what? Well, he comes right out and says this: persona est relatio. Person is relation. But in the context he's talking about, where you have this dialectical opposition introduced into the structure and formulation of God, what he's really saying is precisely what you said. He's defined personhood itself as an opposition to other persons, which is the underlying assumption here is you can't have diversity without opposition, which again is a nutty idea to begin with. But yeah, this has become so deeply ingrained, and you see this over and over in Western history, be it religious, be it with the communist state or the Nazi state. You have this defining characteristic of the group, and then all of those people over there that were opposed to. And so what do we end up with? We end up with concentration camps and the Gulag. It's
how many
nuts.
people raise their kids and say, Junior, you're defined by your relationship to other people, right?
Right.
And then, of course, you get the equal kookiness of you're not defined in any way by your relationship with other people. Right. Be your own complete individual. And it's like, all right, well, I'll just run naked down the street. But at some point, we'll talk about that in the bombshell phase. At some point, you have your choice between rapid subordination of yourself to the group, rampant subordination, and rampant individualism, either
Yes.
which are extreme forms
Well,
of defining yourself as person equals relationship.
let's look at the effect of this inability to strike a balance between personhood and nature and how it's affected aesthetics. I'm big on the Baroque doctrine of affect, because I've said over and over again what those composers were trying to do they were trying to, through various musical or artistic procedures, to conjure up certain innate, universal human emotional responses. So in other words, their expression as artists is not subjective in the sense that they are going to the point of saying that all artistic expression and creativity must be subjective and original. Once the West starts down that path of equating creativity with subjective expression, you begin the march through Romanticism all the way up to modern art, Jackson Pollock, and so on and so forth, where you have a complete collapse of any reference to something outside the individual person. So in other words, again, we've lost balance. We're living in an artistic culture, which is equally either subsumed in a group that you must express your assent to the modern aesthetic by creating works of artistic ugliness, or you express it by absolute subjectivity. But they both boil down to about the same thing, absolute subjectivity. So in other words, this dialectical way of thinking has basically infected everything in Western culture. Everything.
Well, it exists in just plain old cigar store ideological debate.
Sure,
I hate debating politics in a cigar store. I'm like, can I just sit over there? But switch with me. You look like you want to argue with these guys, but you're talking about that concept of affect. It's almost like, and I think it's called a soundboard, where you press and there's a boing, and you press another button and there's a, and you press another button and there's a siren. We've used those boards on the show before, and a lot of people do it for sound effects. They used to do it during radio dramas. They'd have these boards. You're talking about an emotional soundboard for that is objectively, we understand what to create reverence and awe is, right?
Well,
right?
think of film music,
right,
as being a perfect example of the modern application of affect.
Yeah, nobody watches a Pixar film and sees and thinks, oh, they're trying to inspire affect and awe, or awe and reverence, because that's how it comes off to me. It's like, no, you get that they're being squirrely.
Yeah, exactly. Bingo. Exactly. Film music is the primary example that this is a doctrine that's still around. It's just that people don't like to think about it in those terms, because once you start thinking about art in that way, then art begins to manifest itself as what? Well, it begins to manifest itself as a technique for the manipulation of the mind and its emotions, which is what it is. It's always been that way.
People want to say that art doesn't control me, that I have my own unique response to it, and they want to validate the freedom of the aesthete that participates in the art, but not validate the freedom of the artist to make an objective statement.
Right, exactly. Bingo. So
yeah, again, I don't love that, but in ideological speech, it's the same thing. So you get somebody that's mouthing an opinion. They say, well, my theory about, and then they go off, Hillary Clinton, whatever it is. And it's strange, because that theory sounds exactly like a theory I heard on talk radio that was a copy of another theory I heard on a more popular talk radio.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, did you come up with that theory? And people like to present that this all comes from their original thinking, because the absolute autonomy of thought of the individual and the rejection of objectivity has got them. And
it's interesting.
I wish they would just press a button on a soundboard.
It's interesting.
Here's a board, theory about Hillary #1, theory about Hillary. Just press the one that corresponds and let me go home.
It's interesting because Voegelin gets into this. And one of the things he points out is that in this move to an absolute subjectivity, what you really end up with is a new kind of groupthink that's even more dangerous in a certain sense, because it is a kind of a free-for-all where there is no common agreed upon objective set of symbols or institutions or what have you, and everything begins to collapse as a result of this. And he spends an enormous amount of time analyzing the collapse of symbols all the way from, you know, Plato and Aristotle forward. So, you know, if people want to understand this kind of secular approach that you and I are talking about with regards to these marketing schemes, sit down and read Voegelin. He's difficult reading, I'll have to say, but if you really understand what he's getting at here, he's really talking about this kind of subjectivist aesthetic versus a doctrine of affect, quite literally, if I could put it that way.
Well, this subjectification of all things, it leads ultimately to solipsism, because so I was at a cigar bar recently, and the guy said, there was a guy in the group of 6 other guys, and he says, I don't believe anything I see on the news. I don't think any source of information could be trusted. But and he's like, what do you think about that? And I said, I think we can't have a conversation. He said, so you believe everything the New York Times says? And I said, no, but I think
I read it.
When the New York Times and the Washington Post and 6 other media outlets, including the guy they're quoting, says that he did, said, and was X, that, yeah, I think there's a reasonable amount of evidence. And he says, well, that doesn't prove it to me. And I said, well, your first mistake is that you've confused proof with evidence. And the second mistake is that by subjectifying everything, the problem is we all need you now. So you really do believe in one objective source of information. It's just you. It's solipsism. You're the only one that exists. You can think for yourself, but nobody can have you think for them. So if we all do that, I say again, I don't think we can have a conversation, because all of us are just unable to accept anything the other person says.
You end up if you put what you've just said in artistic terms, you end up with the music of an Arnold Schoenberg, which can be, you know,
the dialectic of all things against each other.
Well, you end up with a musical expression which, if you examine it carefully, has a great deal of rationality, but that rationality has been employed against the objective basis of all music. So you end up with a music that's kind of a policy statement rather than actual music. And it's a policy statement of a completely subjective aesthetic that, in order to be fully creative now, we have to reject all of that and we have to do this. So you end up with a music that no one but Schoenberg can understand.
But that's, you know, I've kept kind of quiet about this, but my qualm with the whole fake news meme and the concept of fake news is that when you put that into a visual art or a music template, if you get Schoenberg and Jackson Pollock, and but you just get it with your own intellect and your ability to process information. So it is one thing to say that I don't trust everything I read. It is one thing to use critical reasoning skills and to say that sometimes I believe the facts are wrong, or the facts are selected, or the facts are selected in such a way that to support a narrative. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say I reject anything that comes out that doesn't fit with my existing narrative, and I have my own take on things. I am the source of information, because then you make thoughts that only you can hear and understand. Just like Schoenberg is making music that only he can understand, or Jackson Pollock is making art. We can stare at it and pretend that we get something deep out of it, but whatever we're getting isn't what Jackson Pollock was thinking when he dumped that stuff on the floor. He wasn't sitting there doing this, staring at it for an hour. He was throwing stuff on the floor. And
exactly.
You're not in the same mental state, so quit being pretentious, right? And to a certain degree, I think the fake news meme is a form of pretension. I'm not a fan of it, because artistically, it's suicide.
Well, it's suicide artistically. It's suicide philosophically. It's really bowing to the Goebbels propaganda idea that, you know,
You're
there's,
going toward the bombshell segment of our show.
well, but that's what it is.
Nazis.
You know, that's what it is. I'm very skeptical of the mainstream media, as you know, but that doesn't mean I don't read it. And that doesn't mean I don't blog from their sources. You know, I have my own template for reading these things, which I hope is reasoned and arguable. But what I'm hearing from so many people is that they are locking themselves into an ultimately kind of Gnostic pose with regard to everything out there, so that they're ending up that they are not part of any sort of culture other than whatever it is they're carrying around inside their skull.
Solipsism.
Yeah, and again, you cannot have a culture based on that. It won't function.
Well, we end up alienated from everybody else in the end. And I've seen this, where I saw this play out is in the fragmentation of Protestantism into zillions and zillions of denominations.
Exactly.
You've got Bible churches from Dallas Theological Seminary excommunicating other Bible churches, inventing excommunication just because they needed a way to say, we reject you. And, over some trivial matter of terminology, because the only reality is the one.
Well, what you have, I think, in that phenomenon, again, is this idea of marketing. Everybody has their own special brand, their own special take, and it's that they market.
I just wish they were more original. I get sick every time I hear a guy saying, you know what I think about this, and then he espouses something I heard on the radio 5 minutes earlier. And I'm like, yeah, I could have just tuned into the radio to find out what you think.
Yeah,
I mean, let's be honest. Guys get mad. They want to fight when you tell them that. But I'm like, look, your opinion's not original. I've heard it before. Come to me when you got something new.
And the problem is they won't be able to, because the end result of solipsism is it repeats itself. You know, I keep going back to Schoenberg because I think this example is crucial for people to understand. What happened in the musical academies is that everybody leapt on that bandwagon, the serialist bandwagon, so that you were expected, if you were studying composition, to learn these methods and use them in your own compositions. And what it's done is it's created a kind of movement of anti-music in classical music, such that, to the extent that, and I think Bernstein is absolutely correct here, to the extent that the objective tonal tradition of music was not preserved in the high tradition of classical music, it was preserved in popular music, because that's where it exists.
Well, it's like what you're talking about in film music. We do have the objective production of emotion, but in classical music now, we deny that that's even possible, because I think it's an insult to me. You know, I walk out of any art lecture where somebody is asking the audience what the art means to them or how it impacts them. First, I don't give a crap. I didn't come here for the peanut gallery. But second, is that's not what the art is. The art is objectively there. It is objectively something, and the impression of it isn't the art. We have to be able to distinguish between the object and the subject, and that.
Well, we have to re-educate ourselves.
Failure of thought.
We have to re-educate ourselves to the point that we understand the craft of a particular artist and what they're trying to do. I mean, we're so cut off from that we can't stand in front of a Rembrandt or Velázquez anymore and understand what it is that the craft and the art is trying to do. We're that cut off from it. I'm convinced that this is one reason people have difficulty listening to Baroque music, which I love, is because they've cut themselves off from the craft that produced it, and they're in this solipsistic kind of gnosis culture.
I hear a visual art webinar. I hear a slide deck with pictures of Rembrandts and
Poussins and Velázquez.
And this voice, it sounds vaguely like Dr. Farrell explaining what these guys are trying to do, because where else are you going to get it? So to take us to the bombshell part of the show, I want to ask you if you need to go get rid of some of your raspberry iced tea.
I suppose I should.
Are you going to leave the cowboy hat behind?
Oh no, I'm taking out my earplugs.
Okay. I thought you were going to leave it with us as kind of an iconic character that would entertain us while you're gone. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is normally our commercial break. So I'll use this opportunity to have some gooey tart chocolate chips from San Francisco because they are extra semi-sweet. And if you don't know what that means, to be extra semi-something, I don't either, but it's good. Extra semi-sweet. Once again, for those people that need a close-up on the label, I guess it's gooey tart for those people that don't speak French or Dutch or whatever it is. It's got two, looks like it has two U's. San Francisco. Fair trade certified. 55% cocoa. Not your ordinary chocolate chip. Good stuff. Gluten-free, peanut-free, non-GMO, fair trade certified, all natural, 55% cocoa, Akoma, A-K-O-M-A. I don't know what that means. Well, I bought it to put in smoothies. Little mint, little coconut milk, some chocolate chips, add a banana and an avocado.
Okay, back.
You're back. I was having chocolate chips in your absence. Well, so this brings us to the Nazi part of our show, or
jeez,
or at least we'll get there. Let's put it that way.
Maybe.
So, Dr. Farrell, so we're talking about cults, and I have a question I want to ask, and then while that question sizzles a little bit on your brain, I want to point out two examples that prompt me to ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, we've talked a lot about cults, and yes, I thought of Bill Cosby and all of that, but I think that's a stretch. Where my mind went is a suspicion that there may be some kind of cult-like structure behind some of the modern mass shootings that we're seeing.
Yes.
And so I want to bring to your attention two different groups that I'm considering. One is called incel. So incel is short for involuntarily celibate. It's actually a thing. So this is an article from the New Statesman. In 1997, when the internet was young and far more innocent, a woman called Alana built a text-only site as a community for people who were, as she termed it, involuntarily celibate. She was a virgin in her mid-20s and felt lonely and isolated, afraid that she'd be alone forever. She told her story to the Globe and Mail in the aftermath of this week's van attack in Toronto, an act suspected to be heavily influenced by an ideology called incel. Incel, typically, and if you're wondering if this still has relevance, the guy in the Waffle House shooting was an incel. Or I'm sorry, Waffle House is the other group. But anyway, incel, a typically internet contraction of the initial term formed by Alana, is a lifestyle defined by the inability to find a consenting sexual partner. It has its own lexicon of terms which can seem impenetrable to outsiders. We talked about that. And tends to manifest itself in young men for whom women have become the enemy. So more of the adherents are men. The subculture turns women into a dangerous other, both desperately desired and passionately hated all at once. So what began as a positive move by some people seeking others but experiencing loneliness mutated horribly over time. And it goes on then to say, it talks about how it develops, and it says, despite incel emerging blinking into the light of the mainstream in the aftermath of Rogers' gun attack at the University of California, Santa Barbara, when 6 people were killed, people seem to have rapidly forgotten about the subculture. And here's the thing, it's not a Waffle House. It has hit the headlines again this week after Alek Manassian, who appears to have defended himself as incel, participated in incel communities and reportedly posted a message on Facebook heralding an incel revolution, allegedly killed 10 people using a van as a weapon. So this is the first group. You got this group of people that seems to be responsible for some mass attacks, or at least more accurately, it's not the group, but members of the group seem to have seem to congeal the necessary ingredients for one of these attacks.
Mhm.
Then there's another one, and this group is called the Sovereign Citizens, and they're tracked by the FBI. This is a Newsweek article. What is the Sovereign Citizen Movement? Travis Rinking, the 29-year-old man who police said opened fire on patrons of a Waffle House in the Antioch area of Nashville, Tennessee, killing 4, called himself a, quote, sovereign citizen, unquote, in July 2017 while clashing with the Secret Service outside the White House. And the article goes on to talk about this particular group and other sort of violent acts who have happened on a lesser scale.
Mhm.
But have nonetheless made the news. One guy got a 485-year prison sentence as a sovereign citizen movement. There's a lot going on. The sovereign citizen people basically say, I don't adhere to any laws. I don't adhere to any government or any rules of society. I essentially make my own rules. So it is the
Mhm.
political form of solipsism.
Mhm.
And so when I look at these sort of homespun groups that are spitting up, that are based on a particular ideological premise, involuntarily celibate, sovereign citizen, etc., I have a couple of questions. One is, what connections have you seen, or what relationship have you seen between modern mass shootings that isn't being widely discussed, that is suggestive of a cult-like structure? Because everybody's looking for some hidden thing that goes on. Some people are focused just on the culture, the rise of gun ownership. Other people are saying it's white men who are angry to be left out. And there certainly does seem to be a lot of misogyny involved in this, a lot of treatment of women as others, but also people in general that aren't like me as other. This rejection of something, this Protestantism against somebody else that is part of that relationship person equals relationship, the dialectic rejection of something else. But also, I can't help but feel that as I look at some of this behavior in cults that we've talked about, control files, sex rituals, initiating people in the mysteries, they would have called it in Dionysian terms, subsuming a sense of self, cognitive dissonance, I can't help but feel like I'm spotting the earmarks of Nazi technology. And by technology, I don't mean like electronics,
I know.
but Nazi mind technology,
Mhm.
both in format and in its potential intelligence uses.
Mhm.
And I don't mean that I think the government is secretly cooking up mass shootings to get us all to turn in our guns. And I don't think George Soros is secretly cooking up mass shootings as theater, and they're not really happening. I think actual people are dying and they're being put in coffins and buried.
Right.
But I can't help but feel like there is something potentially linking these things together besides merely culture.
I do. Let me put my cards on the table. I do think a lot of these mass shootings are a form of weaponizing people to serve an agenda. And I do think that agenda is largely one to get people to turn in their guns. I don't think it'll work, but I do think that there is that agenda. But there's a deeper agenda. And the one that you're suggesting here is that perhaps some of these people, by joining these movements, are, their control files are being used to condition them to go out. And by conditioning, I don't mean in a sense where they're fully conscious, responsible agents. In other words, I'm thinking Sirhan here, where there's a clear case, I think, to be made that this man was made a patsy through some sort of mind control techniques and technologies to go out and try and shoot Senator Kennedy. I do think that those technologies exist, and I do think that these types of cults are tailor-made for that type of activity. So I do think that there's something to your suggestion here. There have been a number of articles and claims on the internet, which I have seen, I've never talked about because I'm not satisfied that there's enough evidence to suggest these types of activities are deliberate. But by the same token, I do think that there's a discernible pattern to these things that now seems to be clear. You have an incident, you have a mass shooting, people die, and then we have, the appearance of that, I don't remember that kid after the Florida shooting. Her last name is Hogg. I don't remember, but this kid frightens me because he's clearly some sort of fascist in the way he wants to think and what he's saying, and he's being promoted. So I see this pattern of incident, spokesman, promotion, and agenda, and it's happening over and over again. So when there's a pattern, that suggests to me that there's somebody behind trying to orchestrate this. What bothers me more about what you've just said is something that isn't really germane to your question. And that's this phenomenon now that we see more and more men and women opting out of any sort of family or social life in the culture. And you pointed out something that I've also noticed myself. It's largely men that are doing this, simply opting out. I think part of that is coming from a perception, I share it myself, of the traditional institutions of family and so on. And I came to this conclusion, in college. It was just not a risk that I wanted to take. The laws were against me. Should I ever get married and have children, they were terribly slanted in favor of women. I see more and more men expressing that same risk assessment and simply opting out. So now you get the reaction, as you pointed out with this incel group of women, that are celibate, not by any choice of their own. But this is happening in the culture at large. And I think, again, this is coming out of a culture that's mad, utterly mad, with Gnostic techniques of revision. This began when they changed the forms. I noticed this in the 70s and 80s when they changed the forms from sex, click a box, male or female, to gender, which now becomes something linguistic rather than something biological. And once that change is made, then you open yourself up to manipulations of that reality through language, which is a classic definition of Gnosticism, is the manipulation of reality through language. The idea that if you call something, it is that, whether it is really objectively or not. And that's something that bothers me too. So I'm on two tracks with your question here. I think we're looking at a cultural reaction in the form of these men's and women's groups that are looking at all of this and saying, no, we don't want this, and we're not going to participate in whatever way they choose to do it, be it celibacy or what have you. And on the other hand, looking at all of these shootings and the pattern that seems to be recurring over and over and over again of some person going off their rocker. And the only thing that I can conclude is, like you, I think you're looking at some sort of fascist application of mind manipulation technologies. This is the only conclusion I can come to. Again, I point out, I've looked at the issue. I've looked at all of the articles and conspiracy theories on the internet. I have not found any good evidence for that other than the pattern itself.
Well, I don't mean that. I think that the government or some entity is behind the mass shootings. I
understand that.
I just mean that I see that there's a pattern of behavior that implies a certain consistency, it seems like the people doing the work are not intelligent enough to have created that.
Right, exactly.
And so It's something that they've gone into. Now, I don't I don't forgive them in the sense that, oh, they're victims, and the real enemy is the people that are saying, hey, maybe we should have done something about this guy before he shot everybody. I'm not going to go that far. I think these people are heinous people that that I don't have any truck with. But what I guess I'm wondering about is the potential for, and I use this phrase in quotes and almost tongue in cheek when I say Nazi technology, but the potential for the equivalent of Nazi technology in the wild. Because, and when I say in the wild, I mean almost as though it's like farm salmon have gotten free into the ocean, and they're breeding with the regular salmon. They're in the wild, they're loose, and they're polluting the environment and weakening the species. So
I again, my remarks are not that I think the government is behind this, but somebody is, whether it's a rogue group in the government or some third entity that's not even a government in any recognizable territorial sense, or it could be, as you say, it's out in the wild. It's something that is now deeply embedded in the culture that's happening.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about, is if it any longer needs control or is even submissible to control, but maybe what we have is nobody is watching this thing, and it is taking on a life of its own, like a virus that's going on untreated. And it is a form of reasoning, a form of Gnostic thinking or fascist thinking.
I think that's entirely possible.
Came into our culture during the Cold War. But now we no longer need it to drive the Cold War, because the Cold War is over. And so now it's sitting out there sort of unsupervised, but it's still infecting the heck out of a lot of people. What I'm wondering about is if this technology has sort of gone rogue and has a life of its own.
Oh, the technology definitely, I think to a certain extent, Daniel, has gone rogue. Because if you spend any time researching the subject of mind control, and there's a lot of literature out there now about the subject, one of the things that most impresses me about that literature is precisely the fact that a lot of these techniques and technologies are out there and in private hands and have been used at times some seemingly simple things like getting people to sell their house on the cheap. It's out there, and it's not necessarily any one group in charge or control of it. I think that's definitely a possibility. When I look at these mass shootings, what strikes me is the pattern. So I think a reasonable response to it is it could be a mixture of all three things. It could be some rogue element that's behind it. It could be some third sort of non-territorial entity behind it. And at the same time, it could be cultural manifestations. And the reason that the cultural manifestation is important here is that if you are operating from the same sort of marketing techniques, if you are operating from shared philosophical tenets, it's going to produce a consistency in the pattern itself, so that you may not necessarily have to look to some controlling group behind it. So it's the consistency of the pattern that may be a cultural phenomenon. So no, I'm not disagreed with you there. I still tend to think personally that there is probably some coordinating factor with a lot of it, but not necessarily all of it.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes the thing just has a particular aroma to it.
It has an aroma to it, yes, and it could very well be cultural.
But I hesitate to attach to it most of the memes that I'm seeing out there. I don't see the kid that's speaking, that got his school shut up, speaking. I don't see his reaction as any different than what would happen in most public schools if somebody came in and shot it up. I think you've got a generation now, millennials, who are vocal and who, for all that they lack life experience and their views may be simplistic, they also they just don't feel loyalty to the traditional institutions of the culture any more than many of the people who claim to uphold them and don't.
And
so
that phenomenon itself could be yet another manifestation culturally of this sort of.
This is what I'm saying so when you get somebody might ask me, do you think that Martin Luther was right? Not Martin Luther King, but Luther. And I would have to say, well, how does one answer that question? Because yes, there were abuses in the Roman Catholic Church, but at the same time, is the answer to that the stuff that Luther did? It's very hard once you set it in motion. This reaction. It takes on a life of its own, where it doesn't need control. It's precisely out of control. But the fact that we see a consistency to it indicates the possibility of both. One, it is simultaneously in the wild and out of control, not being driven by anybody. The car is moving. But B, somebody had to have created the car. The original technology came from somewhere. So, I mean, your analysis is that dialectic that sent into motion Protestantism, the Counter-Reformation, and then everything from the growth of brush arbor revivalism and on was. And even you could argue the pendulum keeps swimming back and forward to include the rise of occultism in America and theosophy and all that. That pendulum was originally set in motion in the first 3 centuries of the church, and those people didn't even intend for that technology or that methodology of thought to be used that way. So that's why I'm wondering if what we're seeing now is a cultural response, whether when somebody says, oh, who do you think is right, the gun control lobby or the people that want to take everybody's guns away? And my answer to that is, well, you can't cherry pick your amendments and claim that you support the Constitution, but at the same time, you can't go in and shoot up a school and defend that and say there's nothing we can do to stop or regulate that. So nobody's right. So this pendulum swinging in motion seems to be in the wild, and yet the situation where we find ourselves that we have to pick a side, where I'm forced to pick a side in a conversation. Otherwise, I just come off as, well, you just don't have an opinion or you're wishy-washy. That's a particular Gnostic technology that leaves me unable to plug into the culture and still communicate or contribute meaningfully. And that's what I worry about, that somehow the middle has been precluded. And, there's an Aristotelian doctrine, Aristotelian logistical thing, or logical thing called the fallacy of the precluded middle. Or the precluded middle. It's not a fallacy, but it's the logic of the precluded middle. I feel like the middle's been precluded, and you and I are forced to one form of extremism or another.
I've said over and over to people. I've said over and over to people in the vid chats, and particularly to our European and Pacific Rim members, that politics in this country has degenerated to the point that we do not have any institution or party or what have you that is articulating a middle or right political philosophy. We have essentially parties of the left and radical left. And to me, the thing that conjoins it all is that they are all involved in these grand abstract conceptions, and they're all involved in these marketing techniques. And it strikes me that if we take your thesis that these incidents are a cultural manifestation, and that's why they have the consistency that they do, rather than assume that because of the consistency of the pattern there has to be some controlling group, it strikes me that if you take that hypothesis, then at some point that Gnostic imperative takes over and says, well, we've got to control this process. So at some point, people are going to try and step in and channel this process or influence it or control it if they're not doing so already. So the problem is we're going to come back to some controlling interest wanting to get its fingers into the pie.
Or everybody. To get a piece of that pie and get control of it.
There is no, I'm agreed with you, there's no middle anymore. It's Yeats's poem,
center cannot hold.
The center cannot hold. And this is the problem. There's no articulation of those points of view anymore, as far as I can tell, on any national platform. What you have is a bunch of people claiming to articulate that on the radical right, who are screaming quite quite literally, and doing so hysterically, in their broadcasts. And to me, that's as dangerous as what they're screaming about.
Well, I can't help but recall a Star Trek episode, the original Star Trek. They land on a planet, and the planet is governed by a set of laws, and it turns out all of these laws come from an oracle, and it turns out the oracle is a computer, and it turns out the computer was programmed by an ancient civilization that's long since died off.
Right.
So this ball has been set in motion. Nobody knows where it came from anymore, but it's sort of in the wild. The rules are in the wild.
Yeah.
And so if you step on the wrong plant, you can be killed. It's a capital crime. Because at some point that plant was, the only form of some medicine or whatever, and now it's plentiful, and it's ridiculous.
This is why whenever we have these kinds of discussions, or we get into these kinds of discussions in the vid chats, that I'm always careful to try and point out that whether you're a religious person or atheistic or agnostic, we're all in the same cultural soup. And I'm not trying to me, systems of philosophical organized atheism like Marxism and so on are qualitatively different from a person who honestly has come to their atheistic or agnostic position as a process of reasoning, and that's what they have concluded for themselves. And how
it's so frustrating when you express a point of view and somebody says, well, of course you think that way, you're from X. And it's like, you haven't even questioned why I think that way. I may have come to that from a different point of view. And so now do you want me to treat your opinion that way? I totally get it. But I think, Dr. Farrell, that we could be seeing the best thesis for this being something like what Umberto Eco wrote in Foucault's Pendulum. Essentially, some ancient group set the pendulum swinging one way, the belief that there's this group controlling the world, and they died off and went away and their followers are long gone, but the pendulum swings back the other way and a group reacts to that, and then a group reacts to the reaction, and the pendulum just keeps swinging around. And I keep seeing us react and react and react to each other. Case in point, a year ago, if a grown man had showed up at a kiddie pool with a Colt revolver on his hip, he would have been arrested, and in any state. And now a grown man shows up, since the school shooting, a grown man shows up at a kiddie pool with a revolver, and people say, and half the people are scared to death because of the school shooting, and the other half of the people because they don't know what he's capable of. Because again, there's this issue of just because you say you're here to protect us doesn't mean. I mean, why do I accept? How do I know you're not a nut job?
Right? Exactly.
But then the other half of the people say, I feel safe because he's here to protect us and he's got a gun. And I can't see either side as objectively right. Because again, I don't know the guy's not a nut job. I understand the desire to feel safe, but you're not making my kid feel safe. So I just think that pendulum keeps taking us to greater and greater extremes. So it's not just that the pendulum is on autopilot and nobody's driving the car, potentially, if that thesis is right, but it's that the pendulum is actually accelerating. If it weren't accelerating, it might be okay. It'd be predictable, but it seems to be getting more and more extreme at a faster and faster rate.
Yeah, it does. And again, I think part of this is, as you say, it's built in this action reaction dialectic has been built into the culture for so long that people don't realize that there's another way of looking at all of this. And, I keep telling people, own the culture, go back and find out why we're in this mess, because there are reasons for why we are in this mess. And once you understand the reasons and understand that there are other alternatives, then it might be fixable. But it's not fixable, in my opinion, on a merely political level. It cannot be, because most of the problems that we've been talking about are cultural, and therefore they're at a much deeper they're at a much deeper level of conceptualization than mere politics, and that's the problem. Most people still are thinking in terms of political solutions to cultural problems, and that ain't going to work. It has not been working, I would say, for about 70 years at least.
Political and social ones. I mean, because for me, it is the same reason I'm not really interested in listening to cult members, because somebody gets an idea of what's wrong, and then they start sort of, the evangelical impulse takes over, the need to tell other people and to give the analysis, and it drives to further and further opposition with the culture. And I think
Right.
that if you truly knew what was wrong with the culture, the solution wouldn't be to sit around and bitch about it. The solution would be to, I don't mean you, I mean a person in general, but the solution would be to fix oneself. I think
Right.
ultimately, anybody that my way of identifying somebody that gets what's going wrong, and where we came from and how to fix it, has essentially withdrawn from combating the culture and has drawn into making themselves more literate, living
Right.
a life that is honorable, that they can respect, doing their
Right.
own, stoking their intellectual skills,
Right.
living according to a consistent ethic, and raising their kids accordingly, being healthy. You know,
Right.
I'm like, fix thyself, philosopher. You know, physician, heal thyself.
Right.
And so, but I see what's happening is the pendulum that we're talking about is driving us to bluster and blowhardism in coffee houses, bars, and cigar clubs,
Right.
where we get a little bit of what's wrong, and the next solution is to go out and gripe about it and shake our fists, and then some
Right.
guy takes that too far and loads his handgun.
Right.
And I'm like, none of the guy loading his handgun has the least understanding of what's wrong.
What's wrong? Right. Exactly. And I'm in full agreement with you. This is why I keep telling people you have to own the culture. In other words, every one of us is a vehicle of transmission. And what we've been doing in the last few decades is we've been abrogating that cultural responsibility. And as a result, we're looking for external solutions rather than internal solutions, because the bottom line is you can't reform anybody else. You know, that's really the bottom line. You can only deal with yourself, and perhaps to a certain extent your immediate family or association of friends and so on and so forth. But even then, that's very iffy. You know, we ultimately can only deal with ourselves. So,
well, this is one of the reasons why, this is going to sound dopey, and maybe not for the reasons that it might seem, but this is why in spirit I like Little House on the Prairie, the Waltons, what's the one, Bonanza, and even to a certain degree Archie Bunker, because I mean, in a way, it's a Queens version of Little House on the Prairie. It's Little House in Queens, but these people, thing after thing after thing happened to them. I mean, you know, if you look at all the weird crap that the world threw at the Little House on the Prairie family, forget their names. If you look at all the stuff that happened to the Cartwrights in Bonanza, I mean, there's people getting killed, there's people robbing people, there's lies and cheating, and just, you know, all kinds of just bizarre stuff happening. More than happy, because they need a TV show, right? So every week there's got to be some new threat, drama, or jeopardy, right? But the response that those cultural shows, as much as they're pop culture, gave us to that, was not to get bent out of shape and go riding in with a bazooka and wiping out anybody that doesn't agree with you. The idea was to return to normalcy so you could get back to your own family,
right,
so that you
exactly.
could focus on the culture that you were creating in your own homestead. And I don't mean that I'm lauding those things because, hey, get away and go. That's why I chose Archie Bunker. I don't mean you got to move out in the middle of nowhere and surround yourself with a fortress and go all Ruby Ridge on us. I didn't mean that. But I mean that first and foremost, it seems like that there's one hell of a lot more work to be done in creating a little house on the. For all
Right.
its problems, a Little House on the Prairie or a Goodnight John Boy Walton's experience in our own lives and households
Right.
before we go out and fix the world.
Right.
And I just miss, because now, ever since Dirty Harry, we don't have that. Everything is solved by going out and going yippee ki yay and
Right.
attacking the. We have a grandiose epic of bad guys out there ruining the world. We're all on 24, diffusing the bomb set by the terrorists or stopping the secret forces underneath us. And what happened to? I think more good can be done by checking out a library book sometimes.
Well, I do too. I'm totally with you on.
Or listening to Chopin on an LP, you know?
Yeah, I'm bingo. I'm in total agreement with you on the modern TV film culture and its glorification not only of the ugly and the banal and the venal, but its glorification of being engaged in that way and not in any sort of deeply cultural way. There has been a qualitative sea change in those productions. I totally agree. That's why I don't watch TV. I don't even have my television hooked up anymore. Right. So, you know, again, that's a cultural phenomenon. But I do think that these manipulation technologies are out there, and the best way to defend against them is to know about them and know what they're capable of, and to be able to read the signs of people under those influences. And in this respect, those marketing techniques, and this is something that I hope people latch on to, this attempt to market these techniques in modern shiny clothes when they're actually very old techniques, is itself a technology. These things like linguistic agenda, absolute secrecy, obedience, groupthink, all of this stuff, these themselves are technologies of mind manipulation. And forewarned is forearmed. You don't have to. Yeah, exactly.
Well, just to finish off that, and I have one more question to ask in our show, but unless you want to
another bomb? No, another bomb.
No, it's not a bombshell. I thought you would jump all over my Nazi technology thing and start talking about sex cults and sexual rituals among the Nazis, and I misjudged where you would go with it. Okay, so, but no, I was just going to say that I think that there is, to support once again, that maybe popular culture is a delivery vehicle, because so many of the people, look, I live in New York City, and there's guys walking around that behave like they got Tourette's, and they don't. But they, I go to some neighborhood and there's a guy on a street corner. I'll kill him. I can't even repeat on the air because your people get mad, but I'll kill a mofo, and over and over and over again. And just, you listen to them, and some of them are coherent. And the narrative they're spouting sounds like every bad line from a B action movie starring Dolph Lundgren that I ever heard.
Exactly.
I think that we've got a lot of pop culture stuff, whether it's violent rap music, it's action movies for white men with no butt like me, or it's video games for anybody under 40. I could care less about a video game, but I know there's a lot of people playing them, Call of Duty and stuff. There is a narrative that we play for ourselves. And Dr. Farrell, I can't help but remember what news used to be like, what movies used to be like, what TVs used to be like. You could actually sit down and watch a TV show with your family and get a warm feeling from it. And that doesn't exist anymore, really. I mean, maybe at best you can get a chuckle. But I can't help but think, I grew up in the Vietnam era, and I'm seeing people coming back with no legs and all of this. And this, people forget sometimes, Vietnam is the Cold War. It is the quintessential expression of the Cold War. And I can't help but think that a lot of this delivery mechanism in popular culture, this make my day Dirty Harryism, is this Rambo stuff. You drew first blood. And it's like, okay, tough guy. I heard a guy at a coffee shop say that one time. As long as you don't draw first blood. And I'm like, what narrative do you have played in your head, cowpoke? Right. It's like we've checked out of reality and we're looking for which action hero suit to put on. I think this technology, Dr. Farrell, was cooked up during the Cold War to motivate Americans to support a political agenda, that
Yes.
those people who invented it and who paid money to Hollywood and influence it aren't even around anymore. And
Yes.
this stuff is still in the wild because now there's research reports that say we eat this stuff up. And so now the refinement process is purely a matter of business to refine it and sell it back to us, because we eat up the more violent it gets. But there is a difference between Humphrey Bogart, who in Casablanca, who puts his life on the line and puts the girl on the plane and stays to be potentially tortured by the Nazis. There's a difference between that hero and Bruce Willis walking up with a machine gun and going yippee-ki-yay. Somebody asked me last night, don't you think that's the greatest movie of its era? And I didn't know how to respond to that. I'm like, I respect your opinion and everything, but and as fun, like in the way that Skittles are fun, but they're really bad for you if you eat a lot of them. Yeah, okay, it's an okay movie. But is it Casablanca? No. And it's a totally different narrative to put, I will run toward the gunfire. I will put myself in the line of fire for somebody else, like Humphrey Bogart, and I will be the gunfire. Those are different cultural narratives.
Totally. And what is missing is,
and I say that as a
person
who used to be an NRA member and who's owned more guns than most people.
What you have, I think, is the cultural transition. And again, I think you're right. It began in the Cold War. Very clearly, the CIA was involved in penetrating the media, Hollywood, so on and so forth, with Operation Mockingbird and things like that. And they probably still are. Every indication I've seen is that they are. But even there, you're dealing, if that's the case, you're simply dealing with a culture, a Cold War culture inside the intelligence community that didn't die when the Cold War died. And they're just perpetuating this stuff. And it's, it's what they do. They can't think outside of the box, as I said. But I think there's a deeper problem. And the problem is right around the 70s and 80s, I think particularly when Reagan came into office, you saw the transition of film and television from series that in some sense tried to promote some virtue of one sort or another. And now what we have are people, heroes or heroines, without any virtue. In other words, that whole tradition has completely disappeared from the major media. And that's why I don't watch it. I simply refuse to watch it anymore. I won't watch television. I don't watch their news, because everybody's promoting a system of values rather than a system of virtue and tradition that, are at the core of this culture. So I'm in total agreement. I think that everybody's narratives, and that's one reason I don't listen to television. I don't want those narratives in my head. I literally don't want them in my head. People do program themselves to a certain extent by what they watch, what they expose themselves to. So again, I say own the culture, and by that I mean if you are objecting to this or that manifestation in modern Western culture, then quit feeding it. Quit feeding it to yourself and quit feeding it to your family.
Well, I have one more question, Dr. Farrell. I don't think I've gotten to bombshell this time. We didn't go into Hitler's last 24 hours and Nazi sex orgies and whether Eva Braun wanted out. You did talk about intelligence penetration of Hollywood, and I do want to say that Hollywood appreciates it anytime they're penetrated. But they invite it, they welcome it as much as and as often as possible. They're all about being penetrated. But I want to ask you about, I read it, it's just a bizarre article. That's not fair, but I don't know a lot about it, I guess is the proper way to say it. And it's an article, it's in a very biased website, so I don't know anything about these guys, but it says Rabbi Berland is a cult leader. And it's talking about this rabbi in Israel who the police are trying to stop from lighting a bonfire, which apparently he does every year at some event called Lag BaOmer. And apparently what this does is it radicalizes a lot of people, and he gets various followers involved, and there are usually scuffles between the followers of this rabbi, according to this source. And they're part of a group called the Haredim, and it's there's scuffles between these guys and the other Orthodox Jews in Israel. And so whether he's a cult leader or not, I don't know.
Now, wait a minute. Let me be clear. This is an Orthodox rabbi doing this?
Let's see. So it says the Israel police is attempting to prevent. It's a Hasidic rabbi. So
okay,
sorry.
all right.
Yeah.
So Orthodox. Yeah.
I mean, Orthodox is a larger term, and Hasidim are part of the Orthodox.
Right.
Yeah. So so this is a report coming across that said the police are trying to stop this guy, etc. Now, again, I'm not calling him a cult or saying anything about it. I don't know. I don't have a dog in this race, but I can't help but think that this hyper personalization, hyper fractionalism, hyper denominationalism, if you will, that it's causing cults to come back. I can't prove this. I don't have statistics, and maybe somebody like the Anti-Defamation League would say, no, cults have been here just as strong as ever. You're just seeing more reporting. So I don't know, but it feels like that we're seeing a second rise of cults in America, that they're coming back with a vengeance in a way that they haven't before, but almost quietly behind the scenes, and not in a big obvious way. You know, they're not doing protests in the street so much and calling themselves members of the cult. They're showing up and doing protests and not acknowledging that they're members of the same group or something. And I think a lot of that's because a lot of communication now is digital, so there's no need to kind of carry your placard if you were all able to coordinate your events digitally. But I wonder if you think that it's that I'm seeing a phenomenon that's real, or that it's always been here. We're just seeing a different level of reporting, or I'm just noticing it because I'm paying attention to this NXIVM story in the news and I'm sensitized to it. And B, if we're seeing a new rise of cults in a way that we haven't, does this not remind you of the period in 1920s New York when we saw the massive proliferation of, as talked about by Webb, in the occult underground, the occult establishment, the massive proliferation of spiritualism and theosophy? And if so, why does it prima facie resemble that time period? What is this time in the 1920s, if anything, got in common?
I think absolutely that you're watching a pattern rather than simply a case of it's just being reported more. Because historically, when European culture has had these types of movements arise, they have been around periods where everything is in flux, where you're in the middle of some sort of big social cultural paradigm change. We think of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. What we forget is you saw the rise of lots of Hermetic sects at the same time. The Rosicrucians, are associated with this. You see a lot of this at the same time whenever you're in one of these cycles of a paradigm shift. So I think that's part of it. I think the other explanation for it is, and why does it resemble the 1920s spiritualist movement? What disturbs me is that the West, I think, has succumbed to a certain kind of academic trickle down, in that you cannot find any articulate spokesman on any national platform for any sort of traditional expression of the pillars of Western culture, be it Judaism, be it Christianity, or be it Enlightenment humanism. You get more of the latter than anything else, but even there it's kind of iffy. In other words, the Gnostic imperative, I think, that's at large in the culture is, to a certain extent, as you've alluded to, out of control, and it's now being directed at anything that represents a traditional foundation of Western culture. So whenever you see that happen, you have also seen concurrent with it these sects, cults, spiritualist movements, and marketing schemes and what have you emerge as substitutes to fill some sort of void that the powers that be have turned from. I think that's exactly what's going on. This is another reason I keep stressing over and over for people to own the culture, turn off the narrative, turn off the idiot box, and go read a library book or go listen to some music or try and start appreciating the artistic monuments of this culture, because that's what's under assault. And if it's not changed, this is the problem. If the direction we're on is not confronted and halted, we are going to lose everything. And I do mean everything. And I hate to sound apocalyptic, but that's my honest reading of the situation. I hope that answered your question adequately.
Yeah, it's funny. It's just we hear that so often from so many different channels. But I'm a fan of Walking Dead, not because it's not hard to watch. It's a brutal series about the real scary thing is other human beings, not not the undead. You know, it's what happens when society falls apart and humans are your worst enemy.
Mhm.
But you know, people in that show. So many of you who are watching, who are fans, I'll just give you this much, because we fans got to be able to slip secret messages to each other. Seriously, they let Negan live after all that? Gosh, dummies.
I don't know the series.
So anyway, yes, but some of the listeners do. I mean, seriously, I want to see a comment in the comment section about why would you let Negan live? How dumb can Rick be? Anyway, so the thing is that people in that apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic environment break down pretty neatly into groups of people that are trying to build a culture, right, and groups of people who are trying to control other people and right, manipulate the culture, which essentially cause the most damage and have cannibalism and you know, torture and slavery and all of that. And I can't help but worry that if we ever do get into a post-apocalyptic environment, that there will be two groups of people who agree with each other on principle. The culture is being destroyed by horrible forces that, you know, we shouldn't have let get this far. They only disagree on method. One group wants to build a culture, and the other group wants to eliminate everybody else.
Yep.
And it seems like that's the definition of the pendulum that results in these mass shootings and
it could be, you know,
some of the debate.
It could be that you're right, that this is a cultural pattern that's responsible for the consistency of the pattern.
I didn't send you, Dr. Farrell, though, a whole host of other stories that all have an eerie similarity. Cult leader after cult leader, not all of which call themselves cult leaders. I mean, one is, I think, a golfer or a financier or something who just got caught up and had a harem around him. Another is a Turkish sort of magnate who's got a harem. But what I'm seeing is the rise specifically of sex cults, and specifically of sex cults that reduce women to sort of machinery. So I can't help but feel that there's a sort of weird misogyny. I don't care if I'm a traditional male. I don't care if one believes in a traditional male culture. I'm wearing pomade, for goodness sake. I mean, that's about as traditional. I got beard oil on and a beard. I'm a man, but I can't. But that doesn't mean I need to reduce women to chattel. And
no, of course not.
I can't understand the level of rage or what really I don't think it's as simplistic as rage. I think there's rage, but I can't understand what cultic force is causing us to want to turn, to go back to 100 years ago and turn women into essentially non-voting, non-decision making, know-nothings who serve.
I see the exact opposite cultural trend that you do. I see that this is more of a war on men than it is on women. But that
certainly I would acknowledge there's a war on masculinity. I don't. Yeah, and there's a I would acknowledge that it's certainly we have a lot of privileges as white men, but we also are in a situation where we have no credibility anymore.
Well, I would disagree with you. I see this as a war against the West, white men being the symbol of the West for whatever reason that they've chosen. But I do see it as a war on men as much as it is a war on women. But I do think both impulses are coming out of this very same uh, undergirding of a kind of Gnostic culture. And I go back to my three pillars. If you take away the first two pillars and try to build a culture only on an Enlightenment humanism, what you end up with is Gnosticism. What you end up with are the Gnostic systems: Marxism, Hegelianism, Gnosticism, so on and so forth. Because those things have no check. There's no critique being offered against them from the standpoint of the other two foundations of the culture. So I do think it is explainable that you have misogynistic tendencies and a war against femininity, against women, because it's coming out of that same impulse.
But I have two questions about that. One is, we're winding down, so feel free to tune out, people, if you want to. But just a couple of quick questions. One is, why do you call it a war on the West? I haven't heard you say that before, and I'm curious whether by the West you mean just the United States, or you mean Western culture in general in Europe. And then two, so I'm curious about what you mean and where that is coming from. And then number two is, but kind of a devil's advocate, don't you think that just because there may be an attack on men, does that it still is oddly suspicious or weird that men's response is just immediately to do the worst possible thing to women? It seems like that a measured and proportional response, or even better, instead of just tit for tat, an attempt to be, I mean, if some guy were calling me names, I wouldn't resort to calling him names. I would laugh at him because that's ineffectual. So why do we think that the first reaction of many men in our society is to immediately try to do that and worse to what they perceive done,
Well,
done to them?
I think that the reaction to this is taking more than just
more than one form.
More than one form. The form that I'm thinking about isn't this active misogyny that you see in some circles. I'm thinking more of the form of more and more males just simply opting out altogether. They're opting out of marriage. They're opting out of.
So kind of an isolation and boundaries.
Yeah. This is the phenomenon much more than the active misogyny that I see going on. That to me is an indicator that there's some sort of deep cultural thing that they're reacting to that they may not even understand. I'm not saying that they understand it fully. I'm thinking that they understand it partially, but they're not digging down deeply enough. Now, as to war on the West, what I'm thinking when I say that is I'm including Eastern Europe and Russia in what I'm calling the West, or European civilization, or what have you, whatever term you want to use of it. Because, and for me, the clue here is the almost knee-jerk reaction now that you have, particularly in American and European media, against Russia. It's getting to proportions that are almost hysterical and completely divorced from reality. And the reason I think that this is going on is because what you see going on in Russia is an attempt to build what I've said many times before is the first postmodern state. In other words, the Russians have no interest, and neither does Mr. Putin, in restoring a communist state. Which is kind of the way that they treat Russia now in the Western media. This is completely ridiculous. What you see going on in Russia really is Russia's turning back to a lot of its roots, orthodoxy, turning back to an idea of individual responsibility in production, and so on and so forth, challenging on numerous occasions challenging Western dogmas of globalism and so on and so forth. This is something clearly that you see Putin and his advisors articulating over and over. Now, we may not like what Russia does, but I think there's a kind of a visceral reaction to what's going on in Russia, because they're, in a certain sense, turning the clock back, and they're turning it back in a creative way. And in the process, they're challenging the West and what's going on in the West right now, be it vaccines, GMOs. Putin's talked about all of it. And in the process, what he's doing is he's articulating positions that many in the West feel and think that they don't have any outlet in their own countries anymore to express. So it's a very peculiar thing going on. And I think that across the board, you have a war on those three pillars of Western civilization. It's very clear to me, but you may think otherwise, but that's what I mean. It's a culture war. You have the Gnostic agenda reacting, as it always does, against any expression, be it Enlightenment, be it Christian, be it Judaism, against those three pillars of Western civilization. It's across the board.
Well, it's certainly there was an element. I mean, you can't stand up in polite society today and say that there's a war on men or a war on white men without eliciting laughter, because of the level of privilege we've had, and perhaps illicitly. And so it's all well and good when a class that is used to privilege by fiat loses it. It's hard to say, yeah, those were the good old days, with any credibility. But one can still feel. I personally was not there fighting desegregation of schools, and nor would I. So, and I have not personally chased down hippies and beat them with batons and stuff like that. I was not part of that. They're not like me, therefore they don't belong thing. But it can be easy to be lumped in with a particular group and to feel disenfranchised culturally, to the loss of credibility, the loss of what I would just call basic respect as a man, for contributions that men often make, the level to which we are supposed to bear suffering without showing pain, or without showing that we're affected or that our feelings are hurt, to be stoic. The level to which we are expected to earn in silence and provide without question, regardless of the hardship, and not complain, and to basically take on everything from heavy boxes to spiders to bullets.
It's those things that you just said that I'm looking at more and more men opting out of that. In other words, their reasoning for doing so is what you've just said. And this is not something, interestingly enough, it's not something restricted to white men. It's pretty much across the board. And it's even spread to Japan. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and it's not getting much play. It's gotten a little, but it's not getting very much play in the media, or for that matter, even in the so-called alternative media. But it is.
Well, that's what I mean about it not having, not being able to have a credible discussion about it. It's like having a real discussion about race or gender in this country. It's almost impossible.
You can't because
of the dialectical premises.
Yeah, everybody is locked into Gnostic techniques of talking about these things. Well, if the language itself is already co-opted, you cannot have a discussion. This is why language to me is so very important, and not succumbing to the dictates of, you must use this gender pronoun or that gender pronoun. No, I still believe in free speech, and no one's going to tell me what pronouns to use. No one's going to tell me that I have to signal a raised consciousness, because of that.
I mean, when we're not on the air, I call you ma'am. I don't mind at all. And I'm traditional like that. I don't say Ms. No, I'm kidding. But as in Les Mis, that's French. I don't even know where that came from. But no, but it is some of that feeling of alienation and isolation, and not being able to sort of open up or be understood about it, that led me to check out the Sterling Group. Of course, I didn't know I was checking out the Sterling Group. I just knew that another man said to me, hey, a bunch of men get together in the park and we talk about man things so we can be better men and feel like we're understood. And I'm like, that sounds very attractive. So yeah, how do I do that? I thought we were going to smoke cigars, drink scotch, slap each other on the back, and, commiserate. I didn't realize it was going to be a little bit of what it became. But it's a little bit like Robert Bly meets NXIVM, and I was looking for just the Robert Bly part. But for those that know Robert Bly, he wrote Iron John and is considered the father of the men's movement. So I sought it for that reason, but in the end, I found that it's yet another distortion, that when a bunch of men do get together and are isolated today, it's no longer the ancient campfire where men sat around it and talked and traded their stories. It's now something a little more ideologicalized, radicalized.
It's another movement, and it's another reaction.
Yeah, and I'm not a joiner, so for me,
I'm not
this
either.
isn't something that I don't do well with authority because I don't believe in it. But I'll tell you a funny story, and we can maybe wind down on this, or a funny anecdote. So my girlfriend is talking with a younger millennial young lady at some point, and the millennial girl is saying, my boyfriend, I'm thinking about breaking up with my boyfriend because he doesn't ever ask me about my hair or comment upon my nails when I get them done, or voluntarily just volunteer to clean up around the house. If I want him to clean up around the house, I have to ask him. And I was so proud that after 5 years of living with me, in the first 3 years, she would have said, yeah, my boyfriend sucks too. But after 5 years of living with me, finally, my girlfriend says, have you met men? I mean, ask about your hair. I mean, volunteer to clean up the house. And she explained, she says, men have these goals in their head that they're focused on. And if you ask, will you help clean up the house? They'll probably do it, but reluctantly. And if you point out that you got new hair, they'll probably say it was nice, but don't expect them to be walking around in a dreamy state thinking about those things, because society has placed on them certain responsibilities that they're busy doing so that they can afford to have the dinner over which they would supposedly ask you about your hair. Yeah. And so I was so proud because I was like, she's broken in. She gets it.
Jeez.
She no longer tries to talk me out of my scotch and cigars.
Ladies, I didn't say that.
I did.
Daniel said that.
Yeah. Well, but see, it's the same thing with me too, because there are things that I have to deal with that I'm just like, okay, seriously, like cats. Like to me, cats are things that live outside, like squirrels and giraffes and baboons. You don't bring them in your house, but that's like if I parked my car in the living room. But unfortunately, some women, not all women, but some women will bring cats indoors. And they do things like leave hair on my black slacks, especially the white cats, and they crawl into my lap. And earlier today, I had to pull a piece of hair that I'd been swatting at it for 5 minutes trying to get it off me, and I had to take my glasses off. It had wound its way and was stuck in the frame, and it was this long cat hair. So I put up with that, and after 5 years, I'm broken in. I'm accepting the cat, and I'm feeding him at night and comforting him. And whatever. But in exchange for that, you need to tell me that you got your hair done, and then I will recognize that it has changed in some way.
Jeez. Ladies, like I said, he said it.
I feel very successful as a male that I'm still in this relationship, and I got this far. On the Monopoly board, this is called.
I'm not taking any bets here.
This is where I land. No, it's good.
I ain't going there as the youngest and only son in a family with a mother and 4 sisters.
Oh, no. I couldn't do that. Well, the fact that she's out there selling it to other women, like this is what men are. I feel very proud to speak for my people.
Okay.
My people have been misunderstood for too long. And now someone gets us. And Yes. Yes.
Joseph maintains a discreet silence.
I choose and lay out my own clothes. I smoke a cigar when I wish. Outside, that's my adaptation, not in the house. You see me, I haven't smoked a cigar this whole show. It's killing me, but I haven't. And I'm about to take her out for her birthday. So,
well, good. Have fun.
Sure. I wonder if she got her hair done. She'll tell me.
She'll tell you.
Well, it's been a good show, Dr. Farrell.
All right. Thank you, Guy.
I don't want any letters from the ladies in the audience. Every relationship.
Oh, come on, ladies. Inundate him, ladies.